Chapter 574. After making up my mind, I didn't wait any longer and directly headed towards the mysterious treasure paradise. At that moment, Song Feng and Huang Fuxiu were leading their subordinates out. The mysterious treasure paradise was really unlucky. It was one of the 36 minor paradises, but only Huang Fuxiu, a young god celestial master, was there to support them. In the banquet hall, the people from the other paradises were at least at the celestial master realm. Only the followers from mysterious treasure paradise were still at the celestial master realm. Their situation was similar to Wangwu paradise. The difference was that Wangwu paradise had Wang Can, who had great potential. Moreover, there were many celestial masters among the servants. Overall, Wangwu Grotto Heaven was much stronger. This was probably the difference in power between the 10 major paradises and the 36 minor paradises. Huang Fuxiu frowned when he saw that I was following him. He turned around and blocked my path with his mountain-like body. "What's the matter?" he asked coldly with a dignified expression. I naturally wouldn't be scared by his expression. I shook my head. "Move aside. I'm not here to look for you." When Huang Fuxiu heard what I said, he arched his eyebrows. Just as he was about to say something, Song Feng's young and aged voice came from behind him. "Xiu, let him come over." Huang Fuxiu's face visibly trembled when he heard that. He turned around and looked at Song Feng with resentment. However, he didn't dare to say anything and moved to the side unwillingly. I felt weird when I heard that. Huang Fuxiu was such a big guy. His name was feminine enough, but Song Feng still called him that. It was more than awkward. I didn't pay attention to Huang Fuxiu and walked towards Song Feng. Since he was standing, Song Feng's childlike body was even more obvious. He only reached my waist. Such a child had his eyes squinted and his hands clasped behind his back. However, due to his height, he could only lift his head to look at me. The scene was indescribably comical. "You've thought it through." Song Feng raised his head and looked at me before asking slowly. "I've thought it through." I nodded and said, "However, I still have some questions to ask you. Can I have a word with you?" Upon hearing my words, Huang Fuxiu lifted her head and frowned at me. She seemed to want to stop me. But before he could speak, Song Feng coughed lightly, waved his hand, and instructed, "You guys wait here, I'll be back soon." After all, Song Feng was a senior. Since he had already spoken, Huang Fuxiu did not dare to say anything else. She could only bow and accept the order. With that, Song Feng slowly walked out with his hands behind his back. I followed him out. At this moment, the sky was completely dark. However, the main hall and the surrounding stairs were still brightly lit. Countless lanterns illuminated the place as if it was daytime. Song Feng walked all the way down the stairs and stopped in the shadows. He didn't seem to be in a hurry to ask about the seed. With his hands behind his back, he looked up at the sky and said calmly, "The stars in the sky are bright. It's rare to see such a clear day in the middle of the moon." I followed his gaze and looked up. The sky was indeed filled with bright stars. I wasn't sure if it was because the air was better than the outside world or if there were other reasons, but the sky was densely packed with stars. There were far more of them than what the outside world could see. At a glance, it didn't look like the real world, but more like a galaxy map. After looking at the stars, just as I was about to retract my gaze, I suddenly realized that something was wrong. Song Feng said that today was the middle of the moon. I purposely recalled that today was indeed the 15th of the 5th month. However, in this clear night, there were many stars in the sky, but there was no trace of the moon. What was going on? I looked at the sky in shock, my expression filled with disbelief. Song Feng turned around and saw my expression. He revealed a playful expression and asked, "Is this your first time in the blessed heavenly abode?" Although I didn't know why he asked that, I subconsciously nodded. Song Feng revealed an expression that showed he was used to this. He pointed at the sky and said calmly, "All the blessed heavenly abode are like this. You can only see the stars, but not the moon. It's completely different from the outside world. To be honest, I've lived for more than 200 years, but I still haven't figured out where the blessed heavenly abode is located." I didn't quite understand what he was saying, so I subconsciously asked, Aren't they hidden among the famous mountains and rivers? Aren't they on the ground? Song Feng shook his head. Rumor has it that the blessed heavenly abode doesn't belong to the human world. It's the ancestors of the various families who used supreme Taoist techniques to connect the blessed heavenly abode with the famous mountains and rivers. After thousands of years of inheritance, the Taoist techniques have withered, and the truth has been buried in history. I was startled, but I had some doubts in my heart. It wasn't that I didn't believe in such supreme Taoist techniques, but Wang Can had previously told me that the Wangwu heavenly abode was a secluded place created by the Wang family's ancestors after they gathered the 4 true dragon veins. This was already a big deal, but it was much more practical than Song Feng saying that the blessed heavenly abode didn't belong to the human world. However, this saying couldn't explain why there were stars in the sky, but no moon. I didn't question it, and Song Feng didn't sigh. After a moment of silence, he finally asked about the important matter. All right, let's not talk nonsense. Kid, let me ask you, do you remember where you got the seed? Of course. I nodded, but I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I said, however, I have a question I want to know. A question? Song Feng turned around and raised his head to look at me. There was a hint of playfulness in his eyes. Being too curious isn't necessarily a good thing. What is it? Tell me. He seemed to be warning me about something, but I already had a plan in mind. After hesitating for a moment, I said, I won't hide it from Senior. I got this seed from an old vase. I want to know the origin of that vase, and what is the use of it for Senior. When Song Feng heard me say the word vase, his eyes shrank. However, his expression quickly returned to normal. He replied, don't worry. The seed and the vase aren't rare treasures. They won't be of any help to your cultivation. As for the use, when I was young, I had an old friend who was related to this vase. I just couldn't let go of the past, so I wanted to get the vase to remember him. He didn't make himself clear, but I still got 2 useful pieces of information. First, he knew the relationship between the seed and the yin and yang rui vase. Second, his purpose wasn't just the seed. He asked me about the seed's origin, but his target was the vase. The more he tried to hide it, the more curious I became. It also proved that the vase was extraordinary. I originally wanted to tell him about the vase, but I changed my mind. After thinking for a while, I said I got this seed in Hong Kong. I saw it with my own eyes. The seed was taken out of a vase with a painting of an ancient tree. This was the excuse I had thought of. The reason I used Hong Kong as an excuse was that it was far from the mainland. It wouldn't be easy for Song Feng to verify it. Hearing my words, Song Feng's eyes focused. His breathing quickened as he asked, do you know who that person was? I nodded and smirked. The Grand Elder of the Ghost Nurturing Sect in Hong Kong, Liang Tianxin. Liang Tianxin, that old man, had caused me so much trouble. Now that he was missing in Chio's tomb, he was the perfect scapegoat. If Song Feng went to Hong Kong to search for Liang Tianxin, he definitely wouldn't be able to find him. However, his disciples and grand disciples of the Ghost Nurturing Sect would suffer. Of course, I wasn't trying to deceive Song Feng. Firstly, I hadn't seen the magic tool he promised me, so I couldn't judge its value. Secondly, since the vase wasn't ordinary, I had to at least study it carefully before making a decision. If the magic tool he promised me was really extraordinary and the vase was really useless to me, then after the heavenly grand ritual, I would return to Hong Kong and secretly place the Yin Yang Rui vase in the Ghost Nurturing Sect headquarters. Song Feng clearly believed my words, but he still asked, are you telling the truth? I nodded. Of course. You should understand that if I can give you a magic tool that can contend against Xiao Hao, then I can also easily erase you from this world. Song Feng indifferently warned me. Then he extended his hand. All right, now give me that seed. I'll give you the magic tool. After receiving the seed, Song Feng's expression seemed to be a bit sad. After staring at it for a few seconds, he finally revealed a relieved expression. Then he put it in his sleeve. After doing all this, he suddenly looked up at me and asked, boy, do you know how to use a sword? The sword was the most powerful weapon. Whether it was a martial artist in the secular world or a cultivator in the metaphysical world who didn't know how to use a sword, Although I wasn't as good as a sword cultivator like IMO, I had used a sword many times on the path of cultivation. Even now, I still had the Xianyuan sword. I nodded. I'm not proficient, but I can use it. Song Feng nodded and didn't say anything else. Then he stretched out his small hand and drew a circle in the air. Then I felt an abundant whirlpool of Dao Qi gathering in the direction of his finger. Didn't Officer Wong say that this little old man had lost his cultivation? How could he still mobilize Dao Qi at this moment? It seemed that Officer Wong didn't know much about his background. After a while, the Dao Qi at the place where Song Feng was pointing had become solid. Seeing that it was about time, he stopped and shouted, "Open!" Along with his voice, there seemed to be a ripple on both sides of the condensed Dao Qi, revealing a black hole. Then, a long sword with a broken section slowly floated out from within. "This sword is for you. You must treat it well and don't let it down." Song Feng's eyes seemed to be filled with nostalgia. He flicked his hand, and the broken sword flew towards me. I reached out to catch it and subconsciously asked, "What's the name of this sword?" Song Feng had already turned around and was walking away. Hearing my question, he didn't immediately answer. After he was far away, a voice came from the twilight. It seemed to be a sigh. Chapter 575. Armor Stripping? When I heard this name, I was surprised. Isn't this the sword that Song Feng's twin brother used? Back then, the two brothers could rely on their power to defeat the Yang God Celestial Master when they were still at the Celestial Master realm. No wonder Song Feng dared to promise me that he could fight with Zhao Hao with this magical artifact. However, I didn't understand why he would give me such a precious item so casually. Just a moment ago, I was still suspicious of his motives, so I deliberately concealed the information about the Yin and Yang Rui vase. Who would have thought that he would be so generous? I felt ashamed. After thinking for a while, I wanted to tell him the truth about the Yin and Yang Rui vase. However, I had lied, so I had to go back to Hong Kong to make up for it. Song Feng wouldn't leave the heavenly grand ritual, so I would go back and send the Yin and Yang Rui vase to the ghost-raising sect as soon as possible. After thinking about it, I didn't hesitate anymore. I picked up the armor-stripping sword and looked at it. With just a glance, I frowned slightly. Not only was the sword broken, but it was also covered in rust. It didn't look good at all. Moreover, the rust wasn't only on the surface. The deepest part of the sword was completely rotten. It looked like it could be broken into two pieces with a little force. Moreover, there were many marks left by axes and knives. At first glance, I could tell that it had gone through a lot of vicissitudes. Of course, this sword was a Taoist sword, not an ordinary weapon. When it was used to fight, it didn't need a hack or slash. Its real power didn't have much to do with its appearance. But then again, ritual implements usually had a restrained Taoist rhyme. If one paid attention to Taoist Qi, they would form a unique halo, making the ritual implement look extraordinary. This sword was truly unusual. Either it had something special about it, or it had experienced some strange things. While thinking, I looked at the hilt. On one side of the hilt, there were two big characters engraved. It was armor stripping. Song Feng had said that these two swords were created when the Kunlun Mountain's Earth Dragon split the earth. Apparently, they weren't named by someone else. The sword itself was engraved with the name. Besides the words armor stripping, there was another line of small characters engraved on the other side of the hilt. The one who holds this sword should extinguish his lust. I'll slay all monsters with my sword. This line of small characters was different from the two words on the other side, strip armor. The two words were written in seal script, simple and unadorned, without any trace of carving. They had long been integrated with the sword hilt, as if they were naturally there. As for this line of small words, it was just an ordinary semi-cursive script. One could clearly see traces of carving. Although these traces were not considered new, compared to the two words, remove armor, it was obvious that they were carved later. Could it be that it was carved by the hidden edge? If it was him, why would he carve such a line of words? Did he have a grudge against monsters? I didn't understand, but I didn't put it to heart. In the Taoist scripture of tranquility, it was said that Laozi had once said, the great Tao is merciless. It moves the sun and moon. Therefore, in the world of metaphysics, there were many interpretations of the great Tao being emotionless. Many people understood it to mean that in order to pursue the great Tao, one had to be emotionless. But in my opinion, it was absurd. That sentence in the Tao scripture was meant to explain the true meaning of the word Tao. Before and after this sentence, there were two more sentences. The first one was the great Tao is invisible, but gives birth to heaven and earth. The second one was the great Tao is nameless, but it nourishes all things. After the three sentences, the Tao scripture concluded, I don't know its name, but I call it Tao. This was the Taoists' explanation of the origin of all things in the world and the nature of all things. The Taoists believed that Tao was the origin of the universe, the origin of heaven and earth, the root of all things, and the cardinal mechanism of creation. It was invisible, colorless, odorless, and omnipresent. It filled the universe and covered all directions. It didn't increase or decrease, and it existed eternally. It was invisible and nameless, but it truly existed. Therefore, the two words emotionless didn't mean to extinguish emotions and lust. It just meant that the great Tao wasn't human, and it didn't have joy or sorrow. Of course, if one understood it as a cultivator who wanted to cultivate to the extreme and even become the Tao, they had to reach the inhuman realm of supreme oblivion. This saying of extinguishing emotions and lust seemed to make some sense. However, whether it was by the snake spirit Tong Tong, Fatty, or Wongli, I had a long-lasting friendship with them. No matter what, I couldn't reach this realm. If the end of the great Tao was bound to be like this, I was afraid it would be difficult for me to pursue the great Tao. However, I was just a heavenly seal master, and I still had a long way to go on the great Tao. It was too early to talk about the end of the great Tao. While I was thinking, I heard noises from the entrance of the hall behind me. I turned around and saw the people from the blessed enclave coming out one after another. Apparently, the banquet tonight was over. I waited for a while. After all the people from the blessed enclave had left, Officer Wong also came out. When I saw him, I walked over and greeted him. Officer Wong heaved a sigh of relief when he saw me. He said, Sage, I couldn't find you anywhere. I thought something had happened. I smiled and shook my head. I raised the broken sword in my hand and said, Senior Tsong Fong summoned me and gave me a sword. By the way, do you know how to use the armor-stripping sword? After hearing my words, Officer Wong's face froze. After a long time, he was dumbfounded. What did you say? Tsong Fong, that old monster, gave you the armor-stripping sword? After getting my confirmation, Officer Wong looked at me with an odd face. After a long time, he forced a smile and said, It seems the sage is blessed by the heavens. Tsong Fong, that old monster, might be able to sense the way of heaven. That's why he gave you the sword. I shook my head. There's no such thing as the way of heaven. Do you remember the vase I just asked you about? He gave me the sword to exchange for the vase. Officer Wong found it unbelievable. Is that vase a treasure that I don't know about? Even if it's a treasure, it can't be compared to the armor-stripping sword. How could it be? He was right. Although the Yin and Yang Rui vase was of the highest quality, it wasn't as good as the armor-stripping sword, a peerless magical weapon that was nurtured by the heavens and the earth. Song Feng's action was really confusing. After pondering for a while, I could only think of one explanation. He had given me the sword not only because of the vase, but also because of something else. It was highly possible that it had something to do with my identity as a sage or my previous life. I asked Officer Wong if he knew how to use the sword. However, Officer Wong shook his head. This sword is just a legend in the Blessed Enclave. I've only heard of its name. However, we could figure out the function of a magical weapon on our own. Since Tsong Fong didn't mention anything about it when he gave me the sword, I guessed that there was no secret method to use it. I could try to use it later. I couldn't get any useful information from Officer Wong. After saying goodbye to him, I took the armor-stripping sword and returned to the place where I was staying. It was the small Taoist palace where the ancestors of the Wong family cultivated. When I returned, the fatty was still sleeping. Moreover, I didn't wake him up when I entered the room. This guy wasn't vigilant at all. He didn't look like a cultivator at all. However, I was quite envious of him. His path of cultivation was stable, and he hadn't experienced many dangerous situations. He wasn't like me. I didn't even know when was the last time I had a good night's sleep. Since he was sleeping soundly, I didn't wake him up. Instead, I sat cross-legged next to the bed. I condensed a wisp of Tao energy in my hand and slowly injected it into the armor-stripping sword. I was ready to test its power. Unexpectedly, the armor-stripping sword didn't react at all. It was like a clay ox entering the sea. I frowned. After thinking for a while, I guessed that it was because I had injected too little Tao energy. This armor-stripping sword wasn't an ordinary item. I guessed that it had a requirement for one's cultivation to use it. So, I mobilized more Tao energy and infused it into the sword. This time, the armor-stripping sword reacted quickly. As soon as the Tao energy was infused, a layer of dark yellow light appeared on the blade. This light was very faint, but after it appeared, it scattered to the side. After it left the sword, it didn't wait for me to react. It quickly turned into a starlight and shot out. At this moment, I was sitting cross-legged on the wooden chair made of serene wood. With a crisp sound, the yellow starlight directly smashed the wooden chair into pieces. Serene wood wasn't an ordinary item. It contained extreme yin and extreme yang energies. It was the most sturdy wood. It was known as the wood that wouldn't rot even after 10,000 years. With my current cultivation, it would take me a lot of effort to break it. However, this armor-stripping sword, which I had only casually tried, directly smashed the serene wood chair. Chapter 576. While I was still shocked by the power of the dismantling armor sword, the fat man on the bed was startled awake by the sound of the serene wood chair shattering. He suddenly jumped up and looked around in a daze. Finally, he stared at me, who was sitting on the edge of the bed. He asked with a confused expression, "Third baby, what's that sound? Is there thunder outside?" This fellow. I smiled wryly and shook my head. I pointed at the broken wood on the floor and joked, "Yes, not only is there thunder, but it's also about to strike you. I used this chair to block it." What? The fat man didn't react. After being stunned for a while, he curled his lips and said, "If there's thunder, it'll strike you first. You're a heaven-defying, forward, celestial master. You'll be punished by the heavens. What's with this chair? Did you break it?" I waved the dismantling armor sword in my hand. "Someone gave me a magic tool today. I wanted to test its power, but I couldn't control it. It's a pity for this serene wood chair." Magic tool. The fat man looked at the broken sword in my hand and sneered. "This thing is a magic tool? Third baby, are you sure you haven't been tricked?" The dismantling armor sword's appearance was really bad. I shook my head and didn't explain to the fat man. I only said to him, "Release your cultivation and set up a barrier in front of you. I'll test the power of this sword." Breaking the serene wood chair proved that the dismantling armor sword's power was extraordinary. However, the serene wood chair was just an inanimate object. Previously, I had only heard that it was very sturdy. In reality, I didn't know how much power was needed to break it. I knew the fat man's cultivation. If I let him test it for me, I would have a deeper understanding of the dismantling armor sword's power. The fat man hesitated and said, "You're a celestial master. With my cultivation, if you don't control it well, you'll destroy me as well." This fellow was just too talkative. I glared at him. "Stop talking nonsense. I'll naturally control my power. Quickly set up a barrier. Make it as thick as possible." The fat man then shut his mouth and stepped forward. A circular Tao Qi barrier that looked like a flower petal surrounded his body. Looking at the barrier in front of me, I silently activated my Taoist Qi and infused it into the dismantling armor sword. Soon, the blade of the sword glowed with a dark yellow light. This time, I carefully controlled the yellow light so that only a few wisps of it scattered and coiled around the fatty's protective barrier, spinning in circles. The fatty didn't think that the yellow light was a threat. He laughed and said, "The power of this magical tool is too weak." I didn't have time to care about him. I took a deep breath and continued to control the yellow light, gathering it on the fatty's protective barrier. In the beginning, I only used the power of the dragon-seeking realm. Gradually, I increased my power to the acupoint sealing realm. The fatty's protective barrier didn't show any signs of movement. When I increased my power to the acupoint sealing realm, the yellow light surrounding the fatty's protective barrier instantly became sharp, as though the shadows of swords were intersecting. Following a crisp sound, countless cracks suddenly appeared on the fatty's protective barrier, and it directly collapsed. The fatty's current cultivation was already at the glory of knowledge completion. I was prepared to increase my power to the initial stage of glory of knowledge cultivation to test its power. But out of caution, I increased my power bit by bit. Who knew that just using the advanced stage of acupoint sealing realm was enough to break through his protective barrier? Luckily, I didn't use the initial stage of glory of knowledge cultivation. Otherwise, I would have hurt the fatty. Seeing the barrier shatter, the fatty was shocked. After focusing his senses for a moment, his expression changed, and he exclaimed, "You only used the acupoint sealing realm to activate it?" I nodded and exhaled. Activating the acupoint sealing realm could break through the protective barrier of glory of knowledge completion. The power of the dismantling armor sword seemed to be more terrifying than I had imagined. Seeing that I had confirmed it, the fatty's face was filled with disbelief. That's impossible, right? Is it that the sword counters the Taoist Qi barrier? Or is it especially suitable for cultivators with low cultivation? Why don't I set up a formation for you to try? I was stunned. I hadn't thought of that idea just now. I asked him what formation. Speaking of formations, the fatty's expression brightened up. He said proudly, "I set up a formation that the young god celestial master can't break through in an instant. Moreover, it's different from the Taoist Qi barrier. My formation's aura is mixed. Even if it specifically counters Taoist Qi, it's useless. If you can break through it this time, I'll really be convinced." Hearing what he said, I was slightly shocked. In the past, I knew that the fatty's cultivation and formations wasn't ordinary. However, I didn't expect that he could actually set up a battle technique that even the young god celestial master couldn't break through in an instant. After I agreed, the fatty quickly took out the items that he used to set up formations. Very quickly, he set up a careful defensive formation in the house. The formation was in the shape of a hexagram. It emitted a white jade light, revealing an aura that only the young god celestial master had. I didn't even need to test it. I could tell that the formation was purely for defense. It indeed had the power of a young god celestial master. I activated the dismantling armor sword once again. This time, I didn't suppress the cultivation in my body. I channeled all of my qi and true essence into the sword. In an instant, the dismantling armor sword shone brightly. This time, the yellow starlight didn't directly disperse. Instead, it gathered together and transformed into a sword silhouette. Under my control, it charged towards a jade-white protective formation. The speed of the sword shadow was extremely fast. Just as it left the armor remover sword, it arrived in front of the fatty's defensive formation in the next second and stabbed towards it. Like a hot knife cutting through butter, the dark yellow sword shadow wasn't obstructed at all. It directly split the defensive formation in half from the middle. Even after it pierced through, the formation maintained itself for a few seconds before instantly collapsing and dissipating. The fatty's eyes widened again. This time, he couldn't say anything. I was dumbfounded. The armor remover sword wasn't, as the fatty had said. It wasn't suitable for cultivators with low cultivation. Instead, as the user's cultivation increased, its power increased to a terrifying level. A young god celestial master's defensive formation was instantly broken. This was under the situation where I only used Taoist Qi. If I used Shaman Qi, its power would multiply. I couldn't help but get excited. The armor remover sword definitely lived up to its reputation. With it and the Xin Yuan sword, I might even be able to kill a normal young god celestial master, let alone a seal celestial master Zhao Hao. Of course, Using the armor remover sword took a lot of effort. When I tested it just now, I could feel that I had to spend a lot of effort to control every trace of yellow starlight that was released from the blade. Just now, when the yellow sword shadow was formed, I used up a lot of time. When I was in a real battle, I wouldn't have the time to slowly activate it. It seemed that I would have to practice more in the future. Furthermore, I have a faint feeling that with my current level of cultivation, I am still unable to fully display the might of this armor-stripping sword. Once my level of cultivation increases in the future, this armor-stripping sword will probably give me an even greater surprise. After testing the sword, even though I was pleasantly surprised, my body was still tired. I put away the armor remover sword and went to sleep. Even though the fatty had slept for half a day, he was the type of person who would fall asleep as soon as his head touched the pillow. He wasn't worried that he would wake me up if he didn't sleep. The night passed uneventfully. When I woke up the next day, it was already noon. I got up and stretched my body. Then, I sat cross-legged on the bed and circulated my Taoist qi. After completing a complete cycle, I opened my eyes and spat out a mouthful of murky qi. After becoming a celestial master, I could clearly feel that the Taoist qi in my body was becoming thicker and more condensed. As I cultivated, it was improving every day. My shaman qi had improved quite a bit in the beginning. However, it gradually stopped moving and my cultivation stopped improving. I understood that there were many true dragon veins in the world. The spiritual energy that they emitted could be absorbed by cultivators at any time to increase their cultivation. However, the shaman qi was different. When I was in the corpse sect, the Tai Sui had imbued me with his shaman qi. Up until now, I had only been absorbing the shaman qi that had accumulated in my body. The reason why I had stopped improving was that the shaman qi in my body had been completely absorbed. Even though there was shaman qi in Wangwu Grotto Heaven that could be absorbed for cultivation, I wasn't a person of Wangwu Grotto Heaven and would have to leave sooner or later. Moreover, with my current strength, I couldn't temporarily store the shaman qi in my body like the Tai Sui from the corpse sect and absorb it later. Therefore, relying on the shaman qi here wasn't a long-term plan. If I wanted to improve my shaman qi, I would have to find the Tai Sui again. Ever since Xiao Jin disappeared, there hadn't been any news about him. The Tai Sui from the corpse sect had also disappeared from the world. Now, I only knew about the Tai Sui in Thailand's Heavenly Dragon Temple that the black-clothed Azan had told me about. Perhaps he would have to find some time to go to Thailand. As I thought about it, I got out of the bed. After I put on my clothes and washed up, I temporarily put this matter aside and walked to the table. I took the yin-yang rui vase and carefully examined it. Regardless of whether that old man Song Feng had other intentions, on the surface, he had only given me the armor-removing sword because of this vase. Although there were many young god celestial masters in the blessed enclave, and there were even many people with higher realms, some of the small, blessed enclave's forces were weak, and there were only cultivators at the level of celestial master. Secondly, when a young god celestial master made a move, the power was too great. Once the true fire was unleashed, it would be difficult to control. Thus, it was best to send the heavenly master seal into battle while others with higher cultivation watched from the sidelines. If there were any unforeseen circumstances, they would be able to intervene and resolve the situation. This is also the reason why Officer Wong invited me to participate in the All-Heaven competition. Otherwise, be it Fu, Shou, or the others, their cultivation levels are much higher than mine. Such an important battle would not have been my turn. Although my cultivation level is only at the early stage of Celestial Master Seal, with my forward seal and many other methods, I'm confident in dealing with some Celestial Master Seal in the mortal world. However, the Blessed Enclave is different. Any Blessed Enclave or Blessed Enclave's inheritance is calculated in thousands of years. In the thousands of years of inheritance, the paths, techniques, and divine abilities are far superior to those of the same cultivation level. However, I have no confidence in dealing with the Celestial Master Seal here. I can only place my hopes on the armor-stripping sword before me. Only by completely mastering its control will I be able to help the Wanwu Grotto Heaven in the All-Heaven competition. Furthermore, there's also Zhao Hao, who's obviously targeting me. He's from the Xuanda Grotto Heaven and has suppressed his cultivation level to the peak of Celestial Master Seal. He's also a sword cultivator, so his strength is probably not inferior to Lu Jinyang's. Thus, the sense of crisis in my heart became even stronger, and I couldn't be bothered to study the vase. The most difficult part of controlling the armor-stripping sword is controlling the faint yellow light that appears after I infuse it with my Dao Qi. Each of these light rays is a scattered strand of sword qi. Although they're incomparably sharp, they don't have much power when they're scattered. To use them against an enemy, I have to quickly control all of them and fuse them into one, causing their power to explode at the same time. When fighting against an enemy, victory or defeat can be decided in an instant. The stronger the enemy, the less time I have to attack. Thus, I'm currently training my speed, using the fastest speed to gather the faint yellow sword qi. Just now, when the fatty used the formation to test the sword, I gathered all of the sword qi released by the armor-stripping sword into a sword shadow. It took me about 10 seconds. For me, who's using the armor-stripping sword for the first time, this is already a good result. However, it's far from enough to fight against an enemy. Not to mention 10 seconds, with Zhao Hao's strength, I only need to delay for a second, or even half a second, and the result will be a crushing defeat. Thus, in the next 3 days, I have to continuously train and try my best to control the sword light in an instant. Even if I can't control it in an instant, I have to control the time within half a second. I kept channeling my Dao Qi and true essence into the dismantling armor sword. Again and again, I tried to quickly control the sword light. As I became more and more proficient, I gradually reduced the time from the initial 10 seconds to 8 seconds, then 6 seconds. After a whole day had passed, I could already control the time to within 5 seconds. At this time, the Dao Qi in my body had already dried up, and I couldn't continue training. Thus, I finally stopped and prepared to replenish my Dao Qi and cultivate for a while before continuing. Because the Dao Qi in the Taoist palace that Ancestor Officer Wang cultivated had all turned into Shaman Qi, if I wanted to quickly replenish my Dao Qi, I could only go to the lake formed by the 4 true dragon veins outside. Thus, after I opened my eyes, I prepared to get up and go out. However, as soon as I got up, I suddenly had a strong feeling that I was being watched. I abruptly turned my head and looked behind me. The yin-yang rui vase that I placed on the table had mysteriously appeared on the ground behind me. Immediately, I felt a chill run down my spine. You should know that after I put down the yin-yang rui vase, I stayed here. Even though my mind was focused on controlling the armor-removing sword, with my cultivation, my spiritual sense should be able to cover a radius of several dozen meters around me. Logically speaking, within this distance, not even the slightest movement in the surroundings should be able to escape my senses. But this strange vase, without my knowledge, ran from the table to the ground. How is this possible? Moreover, the feeling of being watched was even clearer than before. If I had been hesitant before, then now, I was certain that the thing stored in the vase had its own consciousness. Just like the last time, after I noticed it, the feeling of being watched disappeared. I picked up the vase again to observe it, but I still didn't find anything. Even when I opened the lid, there was nothing inside. There was no movement at all. I put the vase down and couldn't help but continue thinking. This bottle was originally in this Taoist palace, but when I studied it yesterday, I didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Even when I took it out for Fatty to demonstrate and took out a spherical seed from it, there was no reaction at all. Yet today, it had already spied on me twice. It even moved on its own. From its trajectory, it seemed to want to get closer to my body. What was the reason for this? After thinking about it carefully, I quickly realized that the only difference between yesterday and today was that I had brought back the armor-stripping sword. Could it be that this vase had some sort of connection with the armor-stripping sword? The reason why Tsang Feng was so anxious to obtain this vase wasn't what I thought it was, but because there was some sort of connection between this vase and the armor-stripping sword? If that was the case, then it made sense for Tsang Feng to give me the armor-stripping sword. Perhaps he didn't believe my nonsense and guessed that I could come into contact with the vase. So he purposely gave me the armor-stripping sword so that the vase could come into contact with the armor-stripping sword. With that thought, my hair stood on end. I quickly put the armor-stripping sword back into Xiang Lu's leather pouch. Following the disappearance of the armor-stripping sword, I didn't know if it was an illusion, but I faintly felt a sigh coming from the Yin Yang Rui vase. Immediately after, it seemed that the mysterious existence in the vase had disappeared. I heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, I made up my mind that regardless of whether my guess was correct or not, I definitely couldn't let the armor-stripping sword appear in front of the vase again. Due to the depletion of the Dao Qi in my body, I placed the Yin Yang Rui vase back on the table and walked out of the palace. I sat cross-legged beside the lake formed by the 4 true dragon veins' spiritual energy. I quickly absorbed and replenished my energy. Not long after, the Dao Qi in my body was once again abundant. After replenishing my Dao Qi, I didn't dare to return to the palace. I raised my eyes and looked around. I noticed that there was a mountain peak in the distance that had a pleasant scenery. Thus, I took a step and flew toward the mountain peak. After I landed, I was in the middle of a forest. I closed my eyes and sensed the surroundings. The spiritual energy in the surroundings was still abundant, and the Dao Qi was circulating very quickly. Thus, I sat cross-legged and prepared to continue practicing my control of the armor-stripping sword. However, before I could pour my Dao Qi into the sword, I suddenly felt that something was wrong. I didn't know when, but in the surrounding forest, there were several cold and sharp auras. These auras were firmly locked onto my body. Chapter 578. I was alarmed and slowly withdrew the Taoist Qi and genuine essence that I had injected into the dismantling armor sword. At the same time, I quietly took out the sound-transmitting talisman that Wonkin had given me and tried to contact him. My cultivation wasn't weak, but the auras of the people lurking around scared me. I could even clearly feel the auras of the Yang, God, Celestial Master, and there were more than one of them. No matter how confident I was, I didn't dare to be careless. I immediately sent a message to Wang Can. However, after sending the message, I was stunned. The working principle of the sound-transmitting talisman was that the genuine essence that contained one's thoughts would be transmitted to another talisman through the formation on the talisman. When Wonkin had given me this talisman, I had tried it. My thoughts and genuine essence had turned into a light spot that circled around the talisman. Then, it had integrated into the formation. Wonkin should have received the message. However, when I had sent my thoughts and genuine essence into the talisman, the small light spot had been circling around the talisman. It seemed that something had blocked it, and it couldn't integrate into the formation. While I was feeling anxious, a gentle voice came from behind me. Don't waste your time. I've sent people to block the surrounding area with a secret technique. It's impossible for Wang Can to receive the message. When I heard the voice, I turned my head and saw Zhao Hao appear from the forest not far away. The cold and sharp aura on his body was one of the auras of the experts I had sensed earlier. Behind him, there were 2 people dressed in coarse gray clothing. Their faces were sallow and they were emaciated. Their eyes were murky and lifeless. They looked like refugees who had escaped from a disaster. However, they each held a sword box in their arms. The sword box had a cold glow on it. I could feel the cold, killing intent from it, even from afar. The aura of the Yang, God, Celestial Master that I had sensed earlier had come from them. Judging from their appearance, I was afraid that they were the so-called sword slaves of the Xuanda Wonderland. A Seal Celestial Master at the Exceptional Realm, and 2 Yang God Celestial Masters as sword slaves. Even if I could master the dismantling armor sword, I would still be no match for them. After Zhao Hao publicly threatened me at the banquet yesterday, I originally thought that he would leave the enmity in the arena, yet I never imagined that he would actually be so impatient and want to make a move against me at this moment. I coldly looked at Zhao Hao and forced myself to calm down. This is Wangwu Paradise. Even if you set up a secret seal, how long can you hide it? Moreover, Wonkin has always been on guard against you. Once he discovers that my aura has disappeared, he will immediately come looking for you. Zhao Hao looked at me with pity. He wasn't as overbearing as he was yesterday. Instead, he was teasing me like a cat catching a mouse. So what if it's Wangwu paradise? When the Wang family's old man was here, everyone respected them as the first paradise, but now, Wangkin has just advanced to the heavenly master rank and only relies on a few young god old slaves to keep up appearances. Who would take Wangwu paradise seriously? My heart sank. Zhao Hao was right. The heavenly grand ritual was about to arrive. All the blessed paradises didn't want to complicate matters at this time. Zhao Hao's action had actually violated the tacit understanding. But at the same time, the decline of Wangwu paradise was an indisputable fact. The other paradises would probably be happy to have everyone kick them when they are down. Even if he killed me now, the other blessed paradises wouldn't say anything. As for Wang Qian, it was still uncertain whether he could survive the all-heaven competition. What could he do to Zhao Hao? Moreover, Zhao Hao had brought two young god, celestial masters with him. If Wang Qian felt that something was wrong and rushed over, even if he brought Fu, it was hard to say whether he could save me or not. Even so, I was unwilling to give up and said in a low voice, Wangwu paradise is protected by a formation. As long as he rushes over and mobilizes the power of the formation, it won't be a problem to deal with you. Wangkin said that Wangwu Grotto Heaven was guarded by a tactical formation, but he didn't tell me the details. However, in the past 2 days, the fat man had nothing to do here. He studied the tactical formation here and speculated that the tactical formation of Wangwu Grotto Heaven was extraordinary. Even the 4 true dragon veins were part of the tactical formation. Not only did they hide the mountain gate, but they also had the effect of defending against enemies. As long as one was in the tactical formation, Wangwu Grotto Heaven could control the tactical formation to defend against enemies. Although it was just a fatty speculation and hadn't been confirmed, I could only use it to deter Zhao Hao in this desperate situation. After Zhao Hao heard what I said, a trace of haze flashed across his face and his voice became cold. Of course I know there's a formation. If it weren't for this formation, we would have already killed our way here and taken this paradise. Why would we need to wait for the heavenly grand ritual? It was obvious that he had no other choice. After saying that, he glanced at me and said coldly, "But don't worry. I'll kill you before Wangkin arrives. Although Wangwu paradise is strong, Wangkin won't dare to offend all the blessed paradises." What did he do then? The fact that Wangwu paradise had a formation to defend against enemies was beyond my expectation. However, even with the formation, Zhao Hao still had the upper hand. As he had said, if he killed me, Wangkin wouldn't dare to do anything after he arrived. If he dared to touch Zhao Hao, the other blessed paradises wouldn't agree. After all, everyone was gathered here. No one wanted to see Wangwu paradise use the power of the formation to deal with the other paradises. There was only one way to survive, which was to hold on until Wangkin arrived. I took a deep breath and didn't say anything. I just silently mobilized the witchcraft true essence in my body. Fortunately, I had replenished my Taoist chi before I came out. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to deal with him in my previous state. I didn't say anything, but Zhao Hao laughed again. The haze on his face disappeared, replaced by a playful expression. He coughed lightly and said, "I originally didn't want to kill you. I just wanted to punish you and cripple your cultivation. After all, the heavenly grand ritual is about to begin. It's not worth it to kill for no reason. Who knew that I would come to the right place? The sword energy on your body is so dense, so you must have a famous sword with you. Killing you and obtaining a good sword is something to be happy about." A famous sword with me? I instantly broke out in a cold sweat. My first thought was about the Xianyuan sword in Xiang Lu's leather pouch. When it came to famous swords, no one in this world could beat him. However, I quickly realized that the Xianyuan sword was in Xiang Lu's leather pouch and hidden in the sword case. It was unlikely that Zhao Hao could sense it. He was most likely talking about the armor remover sword in my hand. I didn't say anything and started to infuse Taoist chi into the armor remover sword. With the power of the armor remover sword, I didn't dare to say that I could stop the three of them, but I could at least buy them some time. I thought that I was doing it secretly, but just as I infused Taoist chi into it, Zhao Hao raised his eyebrows and looked at the armor remover sword in my hand. He asked with interest, "Oh, is it this sword?" Sword cultivators like him were very sensitive to the aura of swords. That was why he could tell a glance. I still didn't say anything and focused on the sword. I started to try to control the sword energy that was emitted from the armor remover sword. Zhao Hao seemed to be interested. He stopped his two sword slaves and chuckled. "You use a sword too? No wonder you wanted my sword embryo. Oh well, since you use a sword, I'll give you a chance. Let me see what's so special about this sword of yours." After saying that, he stood there calmly and pretended to be appraising it. It was obvious that he didn't care about me at all. I remained silent. After infusing my Taoist chi, I focused on controlling the sword energy in the armor remover sword. Under the pressure, my control improved a little. This time, it only took me 4 seconds to completely control the sword energy. It gathered in midair and formed a huge sword shadow. The sword shadow was very similar to the armor remover sword. The only difference was that the blade of the armor remover sword was broken. The sword shadow was a complete long sword. It floated in midair and emitted a shocking aura. In terms of power, it had already surpassed the complete heavenly master realm. At that moment, Zhao Hao's expression changed. He pointed at the words at the end of the sword shadow and shouted, "Armor remover! You're holding an armor remover sword. How is that possible?" He was from the blessed paradise, so it wasn't strange for him to recognize the armor remover sword. I didn't care and controlled the sword shadow. With a determined aura, it flew towards Zhao Hao like lightning. I didn't know if it was due to the armor remover sword's reputation or the fear of the sword shadow's power, but Zhao Hao didn't dare to resist it. He dodged and shouted in the air, "Sword 3 and Sword 4, help me block it! Help me block it, quick!" Following his voice, the two expressionless sword slaves flashed and appeared in front of Zhao Hao. The sword sheaths in their hands were long gone. At that moment, they each held a long sword in their hands. The two swords had a faint green light flowing on them. The swords were like spring water, and the blades were like autumn frost. They intertwined and swung towards the armor remover sword's sword shadow. Song Feng had said that he could fight against Zhao Hao with the armor dismantling sword, but against two young gods' celestial master sword slaves, the armor dismantling sword seemed to be unable to withstand a single blow. After the sword chi intersected, the sword shadow of the armor dismantling sword completely collapsed between heaven and earth and disappeared without a trace. I originally thought that the sword slaves were inanimate objects. Even if they had young god celestial master cultivation, it would be good if they could display the full power of the seal. Who knew that the sword slave's power wasn't inferior to that of a young god celestial master? Seeing the armor remover sword's sword shadow shatter, Zhao Hao smiled with lingering fear. His eyes were filled with greed as he stared at the broken sword in my hand. He said with a trembling voice, "It's actually the armor remover sword." Back then, in Sword Immortal Huangfu's hands, the armor remover sword's power suppressed an entire generation of the blessed paradise. I don't know how you got it, but in your hands, it's a waste. Since that's the case, I'll help Sword Immortal Huangfu get his sword back. Sword 3 and Sword 4, kill. Take the sword. Following his order, the two expressionless sword slaves quickly raised the swords in their hands and attacked me. Chapter 579. Little Amo's Parents? I raised my head and stared at the two sword slaves that were charging at me. They were a man and a woman. The man was skinny, and his cheekbones were prominent. His tattered robes looked as though they were hanging on a hanger as they fluttered in the wind. The woman looked much more voluptuous. She was round like a pearl and had a good appearance. However, regardless of whether they were skinny or beautiful, the two of them had inhuman ferocity on their faces. Under Zhao Hao's control, they were like two killing machines. The two long swords in their hands each turned into a ball of sword light that swept towards me. In a hurry, I took out a golden light talisman from my body and threw it forward after activating my Dao Qi. This golden light talisman was something that I had remade after becoming a celestial master. Its power was much greater than before. After the golden light talisman was thrown out, it expanded in the wind and turned into a 10-meter-long wall that shone with golden light. It stood in front of me. The talisman alone wasn't enough to fight against the two sword slaves. At that moment, I softly muttered, "Solidify." It was a word technique that could only be used in the Celestial Master realm. With this technique, the power of the golden light spell was much greater than before. Although it still couldn't fight against the two young god Celestial Masters, it was enough to delay them for a few seconds. After the two Dao techniques were used in an instant, the sword rays in the hands of the two sword slaves had already collided. The divine golden light spell had already turned bronze. After the two sword rays collided, there were several ear-piercing, scratching sounds. The bronze wall trembled a few times, and its light dimmed a lot. However, it did not dissipate in the end. Seeing that the golden light spell was able to temporarily stop the sword slaves, I instantly became spirited. I started to channel the Dao Qi in my hand into the armor-stripping sword and activated it again. Seeing that their attacks had been obstructed, the two sword slaves attacked again without Zhao Hao's urging. This time, they crossed their swords and swung them out. The two sword lights formed a huge cross in the air. Although it looked much smaller than the two balls of sword lights from before, this huge cross of sword light contained a much more terrifying sword aura than before. In an instant, it collided with the wall created by the golden light talisman. With a crisp sound, a cross-shaped crack appeared on the wall from the point of impact. Then, the crack grew wider and wider, and in the next second, the entire wall collapsed and dissipated. I didn't expect a mere golden light talisman to be able to stop the two of them. My goal was only to stall for time and buy some time for myself. Unfortunately, I needed 4 seconds to activate the armor-dispelling sword, while the sword servant only needed 2 seconds to destroy the golden light talisman. The two sword slaves charged at me again. Fortunately, I had prepared a lot of talismans last time, so I couldn't use the one-word technique in a hurry. I threw out 2 golden talismans, which bought me another 2 seconds. After the sword servant destroyed the 2 talismans, the armor-stripping sword in my hand once again gathered together. However, this time, I didn't condense it into a sword shadow. Instead, I transformed it into a huge axe. I took the initiative to attack, chopping down towards the 2 sword servants. The armor-stripping sword's power wasn't ordinary. It seemed to have the power of a young god, celestial master. Even the 2 sword servants didn't dare to underestimate it. They immediately stopped attacking me. Their figures intertwined, but the long swords in their hands didn't block. Instead, they used the tips of their swords to point at the side of the axe. Even though the sword servants had lost their intelligence, their battle instincts were still there. These 2 sword servants, due to their relationship when they were alive, were experts in joint attacks. This could be seen from their previous actions. After the tips of the 2 long swords touched the side of the axe, the huge axe that was formed from the armor-stripping sword trembled slightly due to the uneven force, and its direction deviated slightly. Immediately after, the 2 sword servants turned around and moved to the side. The long swords in their hands joined together, and the tips of their swords pointed at the same spot on the huge axe. Sword Qi instantly exploded, causing the huge axe to instantly collapse. It transformed into countless sword rays that scattered in all directions. Even though most of the sword rays shot towards the 2 sword servants, the weak sword rays didn't pose any threat to them. They only needed to block them slightly. I didn't expect the armor-stripping sword to block the 2 of them in one attack, so I took the opportunity to take out the golden light talisman. I didn't have the time to set it up because I was in a hurry. This time, I had more than enough time. When I took out the golden light talisman, I also took out the pure yang talisman. I threw the 2 talismans at the same time, and they turned into a wall burning with extreme yang flames blocking in front of me. At the same time, I used the one-word technique, which was enough to hold the 2 sword servants back. After doing all that, I activated the armor-stripping sword again. Even though the two sword servants could block the armor-stripping sword, they needed time. As long as I continuously activated the armor-stripping sword, before they could destroy the previous sword ray, the next sword ray would be released. With that, I would have a chance to defeat the two of them. At that moment, I understood that the swords in the two sword servants' hands did indeed have the power of a young god celestial master, but they couldn't use their sun spirits. Their true battle power was still slightly lower than a young god celestial master's. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to deal with the sun spirits in their bodies. It was rumored that after a young god celestial master's sun spirit left his body, his speed would be extremely fast. Those below the sun spirit level wouldn't be able to stop him. This was the young god celestial master's true killing move. I had fought against Yin Nanshan's sun spirit before, but at that time, his sun spirit didn't have the protection of a physical body. It had been corroded for many years, and his power had fallen to the extreme. He didn't have the power to activate his sun spirit. Otherwise, even the current me wouldn't have been able to escape, let alone me at that time. In the end, the two sword slaves had completely destroyed the armor-removing sword ray that had transformed into a gigantic axe. They raised their long swords once again and attacked the defensive wall that had been strengthened by the golden light talismans, pure yang talismans, and one-word technique. This time, the defensive wall had lasted for 4 seconds and still hadn't dissipated. Under my control, the armor-removing sword ray had transformed into a gigantic sword that had already attacked them. I didn't even look at the outcome and immediately activated the armor-stripping sword again. Under the threat of life and death, my speed was even faster this time. In just 3 seconds, the next sword shadow appeared and attacked again. At that moment, the previous sword shadow had yet to dissipate, and the two sword shadows attacked at the same time. The two sword servants immediately became flustered, especially the voluptuous girl. Her sword couldn't block in time and was swept by the sword light. In an instant, a deep sword wound appeared on her shoulder, but strangely, there wasn't any blood flowing out of it. My gaze flashed. Previously, when I heard from old Taoist Huang Zhu that Mo's parents were made into sword servants, I suspected that the Xuanda Paradise's sword servants were related to the corpse rearing and corpse controlling techniques. Looking at the signs now, my guess should be correct. At that moment, the Dao Qi in my body had already been consumed by more than half, but I still didn't dare to stop. With just 2 sword lights, I had indeed created danger for the 2 sword servants, but it was still impossible to defeat the 2 of them. I had to seize the time and activate the sword lights again. Only by using enough sword lights to nibble away at them bit by bit, before they had enough time to destroy the armor-stripping sword lights, would I be able to find a chance of victory. Thus, I took a deep breath and once again activated the Dao Qi in my body and infused it into the armor-stripping sword. The armor-stripping sword let out a soft sound, and countless sword lights soared into the sky. Under my control, they gradually converged into a sword shadow. With a flash, it dashed forward and joined the battle again. I silently estimated the Dao Qi in my body and guessed that I should be able to activate the armor-stripping sword one more time. Thus, I didn't look at the results of the battle and prepared to activate it again. However, at that moment, I suddenly felt alarmed. In my spiritual sense, I felt a sharp aura rushing towards me from behind. In a hurry, I turned my head. It was Zhao Hao. I didn't know when, but he had circled behind me. He avoided the talismans in front of me and took advantage of the fact that my attention was completely focused on the 2 sword servants to launch a sneak attack on me. Despicable. Immediately, my eyes widened in anger. This Zhao Hao, who was at the peak of the Heavenly Master realm and even half a step into the Yang God realm, not only had used 2 Yang God sword servants to deal with me, but he had also concealed himself to launch a sneak attack. Even though I was furious, I didn't have enough Dao Qi in my body. In a hurry, I couldn't activate the armor-stripping sword, and Zhao Hao's speed was extremely fast. There was no way for me to dodge. What should I do? In an instant, my mind spun like lightning. Countless thoughts appeared in my mind, but they were all eliminated by me. I couldn't even use the various talismans I had on me. Zhao Hao's speed was too fast. His sword was accurate and ruthless. In the next instant, he would reach my side. I didn't even have time to take out my talismans to activate them. He must have hidden in the dark and prepared for a long time. That was why he found such a suitable opportunity to attack me. This sword was a fatal blow. In the moment of life and death, time seemed to slow down. I watched as Zhao Hao got closer and closer to me. The long sword in his hand seemed to be suffused with a demonic bloody light, as if it was eager to drink human blood. A cruel smile appeared on Zhao Hao's face. It was as if he could already see the scene of my sword piercing through him. Just when he was only a few meters away from me, I suddenly thought of something. I didn't have time to think anymore. I directly reached into Xiang Lu's leather pouch and took out the Xianyuan sword. More accurately, it was the Xianyuan sword box. After I took it out, I didn't have time to activate it. I directly held the Xianyuan sword box in front of me in an attempt to block Zhao Hao's sword. Although the Xianyuan sword was powerful, and Zhao Hao was definitely not its opponent, the Xianyuan sword was in the box. What was blocking Zhao Hao now was the Xianyuan sword box. Moreover, the Xianyuan sword box was only made of wood. To be honest, I wasn't sure if it could block Zhao Hao's sword. At this moment, I didn't have time to speculate. Zhao Hao's speed was extremely fast. At the same time that I held the Xianyuan sword box in front of me, Zhao Hao's sword had already pierced forward. I only saw a flash of light in front of me, as if countless sword lights had exploded in front of me. The light was extremely bright. Even though it was still daytime, my eyes couldn't see anything because of the light. I could only vaguely hear a scream and the sound of something shattering. Countless surging powers converged at this moment. But strangely, I didn't feel any power in my hand that was holding the Xianyuan sword box. Chapter 580. A few seconds later, I tried to open my eyes and looked around blankly. There was still a bright yellow light flashing around me. This light wasn't from Zhao Hao's sword light, but from the Xianyuan sword box in my hand. When I looked at the sword box, I realized that the Xianyuan sword box in my hand was actually undamaged. The only difference was that the partition at the top of the box had been pushed open by an inch. Previously, when I had infused Dao Qi into the Xianyuan sword, there would be a small crack on the box from which starlight would shoot out. But just now, the Dao Qi in my body had almost withered, and I didn't even have the time to infuse Dao Qi. So how did the Xianyuan sword box open by itself? And from what I remembered, when the sword light shot out, the crack on the box was less than an inch, but this time, the crack was more than an inch. I even noticed that the bright yellow light from before seemed to have appeared from within the sword sheath. My gaze shifted to Zhao Hao, who was not far away. He was currently sitting on the ground with only the hilt of his sword left in his hand. His eyes were wide open as he stared at the Xianyuan sword case, as if he had seen a ghost. He panted heavily and pointed his left index finger at me while muttering, This. I searched around him for a while and saw countless broken swords. Only then did I confirm that the cracking sound was from the Dao sword in his hand. I didn't activate the Xianyuan sword, so how could it have such power? Even Zhao Hao's Dao sword was broken into pieces. I blankly turned my head and looked at the two sword slaves. Originally, they were still fighting against the armor-stripping sword, but now, the armor-stripping sword's sword shadows had disappeared to who knows where. As for the two sword slaves, there were countless sword scars on their bodies. They were prostrating on the ground, as though they were worshipping me. The two swords in their hands were also trembling slightly, with the tips of the swords pointing towards me, as though they were kowtowing to me. After stuttering for a long time, Zhao Hao seemed to have recovered his ability to speak. He jumped up from the ground and shouted at me, What sword is this? This isn't the armor-stripping sword. This sword energy, it directly shattered my Dao sword, and even the sword slaves had to kneel down. Even the purple lightning and clear frost in their hands were trembling. This was the legendary king's sword. Once the king's sword appears, all the other swords prostrate themselves in worship. He was like a madman, his words scattered, his eyes filled with shock and greed. After he finished speaking, He kept repeating the two words, Wang Jian. I didn't know what the king's sword he was talking about was, but I obviously couldn't tell him the true identity of the Xianyuan sword. I turned my wrist and put the Xianyuan sword case back into the Shangliu leather pouch. Seeing my actions, Zhao Hao suddenly went crazy. He only held a sword hilt in his hand and swung it at me crazily while shouting, Hand it over! Hand over the king's sword! Ha ha! My Xuanda Grotto Heaven has been searching for this sword for generations. If I can get my hands on this king's sword, I, Zhao Hao, will definitely be able to ascend to the heavens and become an immortal. I, Zhao Hao, will become a sword immortal. The expression on his face was ferocious, as if he wanted to devour someone. However, there was only a sword hilt left in his hand. No matter how high his cultivation was, he wasn't a threat to me. After going crazy for a long time, he seemed to have finally recovered a little. He lowered his head to look at the sword hilt in his hand and forcefully threw it to the side. Then, he looked at the two sword slaves who were still prostrating on the ground behind me. He gritted his teeth and said, Sword 3, Sword 4, kill this person. It seemed that after I put the Xianyuan sword case away, the two sword slaves didn't have the respect they had before. Hearing Zhao Hao's order, they immediately stood up, picked up two long swords, and attacked me again. Zhao Hao stood where he was and closed his eyes. He seemed to have realized that he had lost his mind and was trying hard to recover. I hesitated whether or not I should take out the Xianyuan sword again. With the Taoist qi in my body, it was impossible to activate the armor-removing sword. However, from Zhao Hao's crazed expression, he seemed to be drooling over the Xianyuan sword, as if he wanted it at all costs. Instinctively, I wanted to hide the Xianyuan sword and not let Zhao Hao see it again. As I was thinking, an old voice suddenly sounded beside me. Mr. Zhao, please stop. Hearing this voice, I quickly turned to look. I didn't know when an old figure had appeared not far from me. I instantly felt relieved and said with a wry smile, Uncle Fu, you made me wait for a long time. The person who had come was Wang Can's young god, celestial master realm slave, Ah Fu. Just now, the Xianyuan sword's strange performance had blocked Zhao Hao and temporarily resolved my crisis. However, I didn't know what had happened, and I wasn't sure whether the Xianyuan sword could block it again. At this time, both Zhao Hao and the sword slaves still had their battle power. Without Ah Fu's appearance, I still couldn't block it by myself. Just as I had guessed, although there was no talisman or sound transmission, Wang Can had been paying attention to me. After discovering that I had disappeared, he would immediately send people to search for me. From the time Zhao Hao had surrounded me until now, although we had fought several times, only less than half an hour had passed. When Ah Fu appeared, Zhao Hao instantly opened his eyes, and his expression became extremely unsightly. With a gloomy expression, he said in a cold voice, I set up the 9 exquisite tunes formation here, but you actually discovered it so quickly. My Wangwu Grotto Heaven has a way. Mr. Zhao, please go back. Ah Fu was still unhurried. His waist was slightly bent, and his face didn't change as he said slowly. Zhao Hao stared at Ah Fu for a few seconds, then he turned his head and stared at me. After a long time of silence, he squeezed out a few words from between his teeth. Wangwu Grotto Heaven. Today's matter is over for the time being. We'll deal with it later. After saying that, he gave me a gloomy smile. Then he suddenly waved his hand and left with the sword slaves. After their figures disappeared, Ah Fu turned his head and bowed to me to apologize. This old slave came late. I hope the holy saint can forgive me. I shook my head and said with a wry smile, Uncle Fu, don't say that. If you hadn't come here in time, I would have been in trouble today. All right, thank you, Uncle Fu. I've consumed too much energy in the battle. Let's go back. I didn't mention what had happened just now. It was indeed Wang Can's fault that such a thing had happened in Wangwu Grotto Heaven's territory. Unfortunately, Wangwu Grotto Heaven's power was too weak to deter the other Grotto Heavens, especially Xuanda Grotto Heaven. They didn't put Wangwu Grotto Heaven in their eyes, so Wang Can couldn't do anything about it. After saying that, I was about to leave. Ah Fu stood still and said to me, "If the holy saint is okay, please come with this old slave. The young master has something to do, so he asked me to take the holy saint there." Wonkin wanted to see me? I had consumed too much Taoist energy, but I still had witchcraft energy in my body. It wasn't a big problem. Moreover, Ah Fu was here, so I was safe. I thought for a while and nodded, asking Ah Fu to lead the way. Ah Fu was a taciturn person. He didn't say anything to me, and I didn't ask. We walked through the forest and soon reached a cliff. Ah Fu turned his head and said to me respectfully, "The young master is outside the grotto heaven. Holy saint, please get ready. This old slave is going to cast a spell to take the holy saint out." I nodded. Ah Fu raised both of his hands. Instantly, a seven-colored light surged. Then, I felt the world spin around me. When the seven-colored light in front of my eyes disappeared, I found myself standing on the ground. After leaving Wangwu Grotto Heaven, I followed Ah Fu and walked through the forest for another 15 minutes. Then, we arrived at the Taoist temple where I had met Mo Wang and came to greet us. When he saw me, he knelt on the ground in shame. He said in a deep voice, "Ah Fu told me that the holy saint was in danger. It was my fault. Please punish me." His face was filled with shame and annoyance, but more than that, he felt humiliated. I understood his situation. I sighed and pulled him up from the ground. I shook my head and said in a deep voice, "You don't have to do this. Let Xiao Hao be arrogant for a while. At the heavenly grand ritual, as long as we keep Wangwu Grotto Heaven's ranking, we will find Xiao how to settle the score. You don't have to take it to heart." Wonka stood up from the ground. His face looked better, but he still said bitterly, "If my father hadn't passed away, how could the Xuanda Grotto Heaven's Grotto Heaven be so proud? It's my fault. Our Wang family has always had only one descendant. I used to have my father's protection, so I didn't take cultivation seriously. Now, it's too late to regret it." I comforted him with a smile. "What's there to regret? At your age, your cultivation is already extraordinary. What's more, cultivation can't be rushed. You have to be down to earth and take each step carefully." Wonka nodded, but there was a hint of pride on his face. "My Wang family only needs to stay dormant for a few more years. After I condense my Yang spirit, the other Grotto Heavens and blessed lands will still follow the lead of Wangwu Grotto Heaven." I had discussed this issue with Wang Can. As one of the 9 cauldrons families, Wangwu Grotto Heaven had always cultivated witch qi. When condensing their Yang spirit, they needed to condense their 3 souls and combine them with the Tai Sui. Naturally, their power would be far greater than that of Taoist qi cultivators. So, Wonkin was right. After he condensed his Yang spirit, Wangwu Grotto Heaven would stand up again, and the other Grotto Heavens and blessed lands could no longer be underestimated. But the problem was the world was so big. Where could they find the Tai Sui? The Wang family had always cultivated witch qi, and the servants also cultivated Taoist qi. The fundamental reason was that the Tai Sui was rare. I had talked to Wonkin about this issue, but he didn't seem to care. He only said that his father had told him that when he condensed his Yang spirit, he would have a chance. I didn't know about Wang Can's chance, but I knew the rarity of the Tai Sui. But now that Wang Can had regained his confidence, I didn't want to discourage him. I just smiled and asked him why he had called me here. Wang Can's face quickly calmed down. He sighed, pointed at the shabby temple, and whispered, "Huang Zhu couldn't hold on anymore. He begged me to see you. I thought the sage would also want to see him, so I used a secret technique to temporarily keep him alive and asked the sage to come here." Chapter 581. A few days ago, Taoist Huang Zhu fought with me. At that time, I thought there was something wrong with his head, but I didn't find anything wrong with him. How could he die just like that? Seeing my doubtful face, Wang Can lowered his voice and told me, Taoist Huang Zhu was seriously injured that year. He had been relying on a Taoist sword in his body to support himself. That day, when he fought with the sage, he lost his mind and directly broke the Taoist sword. That's why he couldn't support himself anymore. After listening to Wang Can, my heart sank. In other words, the old Taoist death was because of me. I was also wronged. It was an accident that I met IMO on the road that day. Who would have thought that the old Taoist would be so unyielding? He didn't even give me a chance to explain and directly chose to die. His action of breaking the Taoist sword that day was unbelievable, and I didn't expect that the Taoist sword was related to his life. After it was broken, he died. My heart felt heavy. Although it was all a misunderstanding, the old Taoist had died because of me. Seeing my strange expression, Wang Can hurried to say, "That old Taoist Huang Zhu wanted to die. If the sage doesn't want to pay attention to him, we can go back. After the old Taoist dies, I will ask someone to bury him and take IMO back to Wang Wu Cave to raise him." I sighed and shook my head. I pointed at the dilapidated temple in front of us and said to Wang Can, "Lead the way." Wang Can hesitated for a while, but didn't say anything. He nodded and took me to the dilapidated temple. After entering the temple, we walked through the hall where I had fought with Taoist Huang Zhu that day and came to a shabby bedroom in the back. Before we entered the room, I heard Mo's stifled sobs. My gloomy mood became even more depressed. I followed Wang Can and pushed the door open to enter the room. After entering the room, I lifted my eyes and saw that the bedroom was even more dilapidated than the hall outside. There wasn't even a bed in the narrow room. There were several pieces of plastic sheets on the floor, and 2 layers of colorful mattresses were placed on top of them. Taoist Huang Zhu was lying on the mattress. His face was sallow, and his body was thin. From a distance, he looked like a real yellow bamboo. IMO was kneeling by the bed, constantly wiping Huang Zhu's forehead and wiping his own tears. I looked at the decorations in the room and couldn't help but feel sad. I have been in the world of metaphysics for a few years. Huang Zhu in Little Mo's place is the poorest I have ever seen. As for the other people in the metaphysics world, not to mention Huang Zhu, who had the glorious consciousness cultivation base, even if it was little Mo, who was in the dragon-seeking realm, who could just activate Dao Qi, they would no longer have to worry about money in their lives. Just by doing something, they would be treated as a distinguished guest by the wealthy merchants in the secular world. Unfortunately, old Taoist Huang Zhu was here. In order to avoid being hunted down by the Xuanda Grotto, he concealed his identity and hid here. It was difficult for him to even guarantee his livelihood. It was really unknown how they managed to survive all these years. This old Taoist Huang Zhu was truly respectable. Relying on his obsession to stay here for more than 10 years, he raised a baby in swaddling clothes into a young man. He could easily imagine the hardships he had gone through. I can't blame him for losing his composure when he saw me that day and choosing to fight to the death. It had been too hard for him all these years. Thinking about this, I couldn't help but hate the Xuanda Grotto more. As the leader of the 36 small paradises, they had to do such shady things. When the old Taoist heard the sound of my arrival, he squinted his eyes. When he saw me, he seemed a little excited. He opened his eyes, revealing his cloudy eyes. I walked forward and held his wrist. I gently placed my finger on his pulse. After a long time, I sighed and slowly put his hand down. The old Taoist was like a lamp without oil. I couldn't feel his pulse at all. Wang Can had poured a wisp of spiritual energy into his body to keep him alive. The old Taoist seemed to have seen through life and death. When he saw me, he looked happy. His mouth mumbled weakly, I knew you would come." He was struggling to talk. After every few words, he would cough violently, which made his body convulse like a shrimp in a frying pan. I didn't feel good. I sighed and asked, "Now you know that I'm not a member of the Xuanda Grotto, right?" "I know." The old Taoist smiled miserably. The 2 tufts of white hair on his mouth quivered. After a long time, he said, "I don't have much time left. Everything in this world is bitter. If I die earlier, I won't have to suffer so much." He smiled miserably and put his hand on his chest. His eyes turned to RMO with a kind smile. "His parents and I are good friends. When he was young, his parents saved my life. I swore to protect them for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, my cultivation base is too low, and I can't repay them. That year, I couldn't save his parents, and now I can't protect Amo." The old Taoist panted. His eyes were full of resentment and self-blame. It seemed he had taken the responsibility for what the Xuan de Grotto had done. Apparently, Huang Zhu was a man who kept his promises. Because of the oath he had made, he had sacrificed the rest of his life, and he still blamed himself. I felt emotional. I didn't know what kind of good karma Mo's parents had practiced in their previous lives that they could have such a friend in this life. Speaking of Mo's parents, I couldn't help but think of the two sword slaves. The two sword slaves looked to be in their 20s or 30s, while the old Taoist Huang Zhu didn't look like he was from the same era. I sighed and said, "You're much younger than them." Them? The old Taoist was stunned when he heard what I said. He couldn't believe it. You saw them?" The old Taoist's voice trembled. He slowly extended his hand to point at me, but he didn't even have the strength to lift it. His hand hovered in the air. I nodded and said, "Before I came here, I had a conflict with the people of Xuan de Grotto. They used sword slaves." The old Taoist opened his mouth wide, revealing the few yellow teeth he had left. Half of his body hovered in the air for a long time before he asked, "Are they okay?" I grinned unnaturally, but my smile was full of bitterness. "Yes, they've become like that. What's the point of being okay?" The old Taoist understood what I meant. He seemed to have no strength to support himself, and he slumped on the mattress. Then there was a long silence. The old Taoist coughed violently and sighed with a hoarse voice. Parting with death was the most tragic thing. Although the old Taoist and I had just met by chance, I couldn't escape the responsibility of his death. However, I didn't understand why he had called me here before he died. As I was about to ask, the old Taoist seemed to know what I was thinking. He spoke first, "Take the child away." What? I was bewildered and frowned. I know very well how important IMO is to this old Taoist. Logically speaking, this old Taoist should hand over his orphan to a reliable person before he dies. As for me, I have only met him twice. I would never have thought that he would actually choose me. After a moment of silence, I asked uncertainly, "What did you say?" The old Taoist's voice was slow but firm as he spoke again. "I want to give IMO to you. Don't reject me. His talent, you should already know. In time, he will definitely become the strongest sword cultivator. If you don't trust me, I can make him swear now." The old Taoist seemed to be afraid that I would reject him, so he kept emphasizing on Mo's potential. I smiled wryly and interrupted him. I explained softly, "It's fine for him to follow me, but I'm not even a sword cultivator. It will be a waste of his talent to follow me." You're not a sword cultivator?" The old Taoist's murky eyes opened wide, and his face was filled with surprise. "I'm really not a sword cultivator." I shook my head and continued. "Before I met you and Amo, I had never even seen a sword cultivator. It shouldn't be. The old Taoist's eyes were confused. He muttered to himself, and his gaze became erratic. When I first saw you, I felt an intense sword aura from you," the old Taoist suddenly said after a long silence. "If it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have treated you as someone from Xuan de Wonderland." Almost all the sword cultivators in the world are gathered in Xuan de Wonderland. The old Taoist swallowed his saliva with great effort. He stared at me and said slowly, "If you're not a sword cultivator, where did the sword aura come from?" "Sword aura?" My first reaction was that the old Taoist had felt the aura of the armor-removing sword. However, I immediately realized that I hadn't gotten the sword then. Could it be Xianyuan's sword? Chapter 582. I was a little surprised. It had been some time since I had obtained the Xianyuan sword. During this period, I had met many experts with high cultivation bases, but none of them could detect the sword's aura. How could Taoist Huang Zhu detect the Xianyuan sword's aura? If a sword cultivator had a special sense for sword aura, it wasn't right. Zhao Hao was also a sword cultivator, and his cultivation base was much higher than Huang Zhu's. However, he didn't detect it until I took out the Xianyuan sword. I wanted to ask him about it, but Taoist Huang Zhu was dying. Even if he had some secrets, it wasn't the right time to ask. After a moment of silence, I tried my best to answer him calmly. I guess it's because of the sword I'm carrying. A sword? The old Taoist's eyes suddenly brightened. He looked spirited and asked, "What sword is it? Can I have a look at it?" An ordinary man's wealth is his own ruin. With the Xianyuan sword, an ancient divine weapon, I knew I should be careful and not let anyone see it. However, as the old Taoist was dying, I couldn't bear to refuse him. Although I didn't know why he wanted to see the Xianyuan sword, as a sword cultivator, it was understandable that he wanted to see the sword. After thinking for a while, there were only the dying Taoist Huang Zhu, Mo, and Wang Qin here. It didn't seem risky to take out the Xianyuan sword to have a look. I gritted my teeth and took out the Xianyuan sword box from Xiang Lu's leather pouch. I used my witch energy to cover the 3 characters Xianyuan sword on it. Then I gently put on a mattress next to Huang Zhu and said, "This is it." However, the sword is in the box. With my current ability, I can't open it yet. From the moment I took out the sword box, Wang, Can, Mo, and the old Taoist all focused on the Xianyuan sword box. When I told them that I couldn't open it, Wang Can's face flashed with disbelief. His eyes became more solemn. On Little Mo's side, when he saw the Xianyuan sword box, his body flashed with a green light. The sword spirit I had seen that day appeared out of thin air and floated above his head. It faced the Xianyuan sword from afar and let out a shallow, low cry. The moment I took out the Xianyuan sword box, old Taoist Huang Zhu's body shook. His eyes were fixed on the sword box, as if he didn't hear what I said. After a long time, the old Taoist let out a long sigh and finally muttered, "So it's true. So it's true." As he spoke, he reached out his trembling hand as if he wanted to touch the Xianyuan sword box, but no one knew whether it was because he was weak or afraid. After trembling for a long time, he finally did not put his hand on it. Instead, he suddenly turned to little Mo and said, "Mo, help me up." At this time, little Mo had already put away his sword soul. As if he had been frightened, his little face was pale. When he heard this, he quickly went over and knelt on the ground, supporting the old Taoist's arm. The old Taoist was seriously ill and had no strength to stand up at this time. He just sat up tremblingly and solemnly bowed to the Xianyuan sword box 3 times. I was originally standing behind the Xianyuan sword case. When I saw his movements, I quickly moved sideways to avoid him. After he finished bowing, I asked him, "Why are you doing this?" Huang Zhu grinned. As a sword cultivator, seeing a famous sword is like drinking famous wine. My heart is filled with joy. Little friend, you don't need to avoid me. I'm only bowing to this sword. I frowned. You recognize this sword? Huang Zhu smiled again, but his eyes were filled with reverence. He coughed twice before continuing, "Of course I recognize this sword. This is the king's sword. How could I not recognize it?" As he said this, he seemed to be a little excited. His face flushed, and he coughed again. "King's sword. Just now, Zhao also said that the Xianyuan sword was the king's sword. What was this king's sword?" When the old Taoist's coughing subsided, I quickly asked, "What is the king's sword?" The old Taoist gasped for 2 breaths. His eyes seemed to be bursting with light. He opened his mouth and answered, "The king of swords is called the king's sword. The world's famous swords are led by the king's sword. No wonder the sword energy on your body is so sharp. It turns out to be the king's sword. Ha! I never thought that I would be able to see a king's sword before I leave. Ha! Cough!" As the old Taoist said this, he coughed again. After he calmed down, the old Taoist seemed to be more spirited. He moved his gaze away from the Xianyuan sword case and stared at me. He sighed, "Since you have this sword, you are naturally a sword cultivator. My generation of sword cultivators uses the sword to nurture people. With this sword nurturing you, you are the strongest sword cultivator. I have found the right person to entrust Mo to you." Ha! As he coughed, he turned his head and reached his hand under the mattress. After a while, he took out a crumpled little book and handed it to me with trembling hands. "What is this?" I extended my hand to receive it, my eyes filled with doubt. "Cough! Cough!" The old Taoist gasped twice before answering, "Sword cultivation technique. It should be left for me to teach Mo in the future." I nodded at the old Taoist. Don't worry. I will use this technique to teach IMO no. The old Taoist shook his head and stared at me. His lips curled into a smile. IMO was born with a sword embryo. He can only cultivate after the sword embryo in his body is completed. This technique is a gift from me to you. Gift to me? I didn't understand what he meant. I furrowed my eyebrows and asked, do you mean that you want me to cultivate a sword cultivation technique? The old Taoist nodded. Sword cultivation is about using the person to nurture the sword, and the sword to nurture the person. With this king sword, your cultivation will definitely advance very quickly. You can even nurture the sword. If you use this sword to nurture the sword, how powerful would it be? I don't dare to imagine. His words were messy, but I roughly understood. The sword cultivation technique, or rather, the sword cultivation technique of his sect, was about using the person to nurture the sword, and the sword to nurture the person. It seemed that I could nurture the Xianyuan sword. With the power of the Xianyuan sword, my cultivation would increase rapidly. I could also use the sword nurturing technique to unleash the power of the Xianyuan sword. I wasn't interested in the cultivation technique, but I was excited to use the Xianyuan sword's power. I had been worried that I couldn't unleash the power of a divine weapon like the Xianyuan sword, especially after witnessing the miraculous power of the devil refining gourd. I was looking forward to the power of the Xianyuan sword. Unfortunately, I could only instill Taoist energy to release a few sword rays. Although the power of the sword rays wasn't bad, it was insignificant compared to the reputation of the Xianyuan sword. If the old Taoist sword cultivation technique could unleash the true power of the Xianyuan sword, it would be too terrifying. Not to mention Zhao Hao and Lu Jinyang. Even a person at the Yang spirit realm or an immortal at the Dawn realm would not be able to block one attack from the Xianyuan sword. Although I couldn't open the sword case, I could still feel the power of the Xianyuan sword from the crack that was revealed. It was a kind of unstoppable power. Once it was released, I was afraid that even the sky would be split in half. Although I was excited, I wasn't sure if the so-called sword nurturing technique was what I thought it was. I asked the old Taoist, how powerful is the sword nurturing technique? Hearing my question, the old Taoist Huang Zhu straightened his back and said proudly, 12 years ago, I had just entered glory of knowledge and nurtured the sword for 10 years. When I was chasing after IMO in the Shwanda Grotto heaven, it was the first time I used a sword after cultivating for 10 years. With one sword, I killed a celestial master. In the glory of knowledge realm, he killed a celestial master with one sword. Although there was only a thin line between glory of knowledge and a celestial master, the difference in power was more than 1,000 miles. Not to mention the early stage of glory of knowledge. I was not a match for a celestial master, even though I had 4 meridians and cultivated both Taoism and witchcraft. This old Taoist could actually kill a celestial master. This so-called sword nurturing technique was simply heaven-defying. Even if it was as he had said, being able to use one sword after not using a sword for 10 years was already extremely terrifying. While I was shocked, the old Taoist asked me again, how is your cultivation now? I pulled myself together and thought for a while. Then I answered, I can fight anyone below Yang God. The old Taoist smiled and said, cultivating my sword technique, nurturing the sword for 3 years can kill a Yang God. No, you have this sword, so you don't need 3 years. 1 year? I'm not sure either. Anyway, if you cultivate the sword, when the sword is formed, it will shock ghosts and gods. Nurturing the sword can kill a Yang God? I frowned slightly. The king's sword that the old Taoist was talking about was naturally the strongest sword in the world. However, the sword in the box was the Xianyuan sword. If I really nurtured the sword, when the sword was formed, it wouldn't be shocking ghosts and gods anymore, but slaying ghosts and gods. While I was still in a daze, the old Taoist Huang Zhu suddenly grabbed my hand and said loudly, little friend, Mo, I'll leave Mo to you. Then he collapsed on the bedding and laughed. All reincarnations are empty. Mo, remember, we are sword cultivators, one sword in our life. We are sword cultivators, One sword in our life. Chapter 583. Seeing the old Taoist close his eyes and breathe his last, I didn't know what to feel. I just sighed. Almost crying voice paused for a while. Then he burst out and threw himself on the old Taoist's body, sobbing and crying. The two of them had depended on each other since they were young, and their relationship was even deeper than that of a father and son. Almo's grief was no less than when I had knelt in front of his parents' bodies. I sighed and didn't say anything to stop or comfort him. I just sat next to him and silently accompanied him. At the same time, I considered the matter of the old Taoist entrusting his son to me. Just as he had said, Mo's natural endowments were extraordinary. If he grew up smoothly, he would be a great help to me in the future. However, the old Taoist didn't mention that accepting Mo was equivalent to accepting a lot of trouble. Xuanda Grotto Heaven wouldn't give up on Mo. If I accepted Mo, I would have to stand on the opposite side of Xuanda Grotto Heaven. This wasn't a big problem. Xuanda Grotto Heaven had already attacked me, so we were already enemies. Even without Mo, Zhao wouldn't let me go just because of the Xianyuan sword and the armor-removing sword. The bigger problem was that Mo's parents were in Zhao hands. If Mo followed me, I couldn't just stand by and watch. I had to save his parents as soon as possible. Saving Mo's parents meant that I had to take action against Xuanda Grotto Heaven, which was completely different from protecting myself. If I just wanted to protect myself, no matter how strong Xuanda Grotto Heaven was, I was confident that I could avoid them. However, if I wanted to take action, I would have to fight them head-on. With my current strength, the gap between me and Xuanda Grotto Heaven was too big. Of course, I could also choose to take Mo in, but I could say that I couldn't save his parents. If I did that, Mo wouldn't say anything, but I wouldn't be able to forgive myself. As a son, I could understand Mo's feelings at this time. He had to judge others by his own standards, and this kind of behavior couldn't be justified. After thinking for a while, I called Officer Wang over and asked him about Xuanda Grotto Heaven's strength. According to Wang Can, the Xuanda Grotto Heaven was extremely powerful. The master of the Xuanda Grotto Heaven, who was also Zhao Hao's father, Zhao Chunyang, was at the great completion of the Yang spirit realm and was known as the Spring Sun Sword Immortal. His strength could be ranked among the top in the entire Blessed Enclave. Zhao Chunyang's reputation was only one aspect. What made Xuanda Grotto Heaven stronger was the number of sword slaves under him. This time, Zhao Hao had brought 4 sword slaves with him, and all of them had the cultivation of Yang spirit. However, the sword slaves lacked spiritual intelligence. Although they had the cultivation of Yang spirit, their actual combat power was still slightly weaker than cultivators. In the entire Xuanda Grotto Heaven, there were a total of 7 Yang God, Celestial Master Sword Slaves, and 81 Celestial Master Sword Slaves. Most of them were like little Mo's parents. They were hunted and killed by Xuanda Grotto Heaven and then forcefully refined. Because of this, the Xuanda Grotto Heaven had become the undisputed overlord of the 36 lesser Grotto Heavens. Now, they were even eyeing the position of the 10 major Grotto Heavens. Wang Can's words chilled my heart, and I almost gave up the idea of confronting Xuanda Grotto Heaven. Then, Wang Can turned to me and said, "Although Xuanda Grotto Heaven is strong, the saints don't need to worry about it. Zhao Hao offended the saints, and that's a capital crime. Before the heavenly grand ritual ends, I can't attack them because of the other blessed paradises. However, after the ritual ends and Zhao Hao leaves Wangwu Grotto Heaven, the saint can attack them at any time. Although Zhao Hao's 4 young God Sword slaves are strong, I'll let Ah Fu and the others go with the saints. We can use our numbers to exhaust them." Apparently, he had misunderstood that I wanted to take revenge for Zhao Hao's ambush. However, I didn't explain. Anyway, our ultimate goal was the same. I pondered for a while, then asked Wang Qin, "Aren't you afraid that Xuanda Grotto Heaven will take revenge?" Wang Qin smiled disdainfully. "As long as I don't leave Wangwu Grotto Heaven, it doesn't matter how strong Xuanda Grotto Heaven is. If they dare to break in, Even if Zhao Chunyang dares to come in, he won't be able to get out of Wangwu Grotto Heaven's protective formation. I furrow my eyebrows. We can't just hide in the future, right? Wanggen shook his head. After I condense my yang spirit, I don't need to hide anymore. Wangwu Grotto Heaven doesn't have much contact with the outside world. It's normal for me to not go out for decades. Moreover, I'm going to cultivate in seclusion for a period of time after the heavenly grand ritual, so this matter won't affect Wangwu Grotto Heaven. I heaved a sigh of relief. It seemed that it was feasible. It didn't even need to be as troublesome as Wang Can had said. I had the Xianyuan sword. When I took out the Xianyuan sword, Zhao Hao's sword slaves would definitely lose control. At that time, A Fu alone would be able to quickly subdue Zhao Hao. After thinking about it, I gritted my teeth and made up my mind. At this time, Wang Can sighed, his face slightly gloomy. He added, "Of course, everything is based on the premise that we can survive this all-heaven grand competition. If it were before, I wouldn't have dared to promise Wang Can. But now, I had the armor-stripping sword. According to the rules of the all-heaven grand competition, the contestants had to be below the yang spirit level. Under the yang spirit level, Zhao Hao, who was at the peak of the Seal Heavenly Master realm, was already a top expert. I was confident that I could deal with him. I smiled and comforted Wang Can. His face didn't look better, and he looked worried. I didn't say anything else. Anyway, I was going to participate in the competition. As for the details, Wang Can would know when the competition began. We talked for a long time. On little Mo's side, his cries gradually weakened. Now he was sobbing. His eyes were still fixed on the old Taoist. His face looked dull and silly, and his whole body was listless. I walked over and patted his shoulder, asking him to leave with me. I didn't know if little Mo heard me or not, but he didn't react at all. He was still sitting on his knees. Feeling helpless, I had to drag him away from the old Taoist. Little Mo didn't struggle. He was still listless and let me drag him out of the temple. After taking him out of the temple, I turned to Wang Can and asked him to send someone to clean up the place and collect the old Taoist body. Little Mo and I would wait outside the temple. At this moment, the sky was dark and the wind was strong. The fallen leaves rolled and whistled through the forest. Shortly after, dark clouds gathered in the sky, and big raindrops started to fall. With my cultivation base, I could avoid the rain by releasing a little bit of my aura. However, little Mo's cultivation base was still low, so he couldn't avoid the rain yet. I wanted to take him back to the small temple to avoid the rain, but I was afraid that he would be reminded of the past and be sad again. I looked around and saw that not far from there was a big rock that the fatty had sat on. It was a good place to hide from the rain. I took little Mo to hide from the rain under the big rock. Not long after he sat down, large droplets of rain fell and hit the ground, making a pitter-patter sound. Little Mo's face slowly returned to normal. He gazed at the rain in the distance, and his voice slowly came to my ears. "Master is dead. Before he died, he told me that you would be Mo's master from now on." I didn't know if it was just an illusion, but although Mo's voice was still young, the childishness in his words had disappeared. It seemed that Mo had grown up overnight. I nodded. "Yes, from now on, I'm your master. I will raise you and protect you until you grow up." Mo turned his head and looked at me. After a moment of silence, he said seriously, "I will treat you as my master, but I won't call you master. Ever since I was a child, I've only called one person master." I understood what he meant and quickly nodded. "It's just a name. It doesn't matter what you call me. It's up to you." "Okay." Little Mo nodded. His eyes showed a trace of gratitude. Then we both fell into silence. Feeling bored, I turned to look at the huge stone behind me and touched it a few times. Then I asked Mo, "You said that this stone is a spirit stone. Why can't I see anything magical about it?" Little Mo shook his head. A hint of sadness appeared on his face as he said sadly, "I'm not sure either. It was Master who told me. He said that after I become a celestial master, this spirit stone will be of great use to me." "It would be useful after I became a celestial master?" I had heard from Officer Wang that after the old Taoist had brought little Mo here, he had deliberately left for a while. In the end, he had returned with this huge stone covered in blood. It was obvious that this stone was very important. Otherwise, the old Taoist wouldn't have risked his life to bring it back. Since I had nothing to do, I stood up and carefully observed the stone. After a while, I found a clue on the stone. At the top of the stone, I could vaguely see a very dim pattern. This pattern was about 1 foot long, and it looked like 2 lines spiraling together. Abstractly, this spiraling thing should be a dragon or a snake. This discovery made me happy, and I hurried to study it carefully. However, after studying it for a long time, I didn't find anything strange. After thinking for a while, I gathered some true qi on my fingertips and poured it into the pattern. After I poured my true qi into it, the pattern had a slight reaction. It seemed to light up, but then it quickly extinguished. It didn't swallow my true qi. While I was puzzled, I suddenly felt something move in Xiang Lu's belt. I hurried to check. It was a Xianyuan sword box. I didn't know why, but it suddenly trembled slightly. What happened? Could it be that the Xianyuan sword could sense this huge stone? Before I could figure it out, the huge stone seemed to have also sensed the Xianyuan sword. The dim pattern on its surface suddenly emitted a bright light. Then, a series of cracking sounds echoed. Chapter 584. At the same time the huge rock exploded, countless stones flew in all directions. With my cultivation, I can naturally ignore these stones, but at this moment, little Mo is still at the side, and the flying stones might hurt him. I reacted immediately and tried to pull Mo behind me. However, because the power of the stone explosion was too great, I couldn't react in time. I could only hurriedly release the true yuan in my body and wrap Mo's body, dodging the stone attack. After the flying stones dissipated, I looked up and saw that the huge rock had completely disappeared. There was only a round stone the size of a human head left. It was completely silver and covered in inscriptions. Each inscription looked like a small sword. Countless small swords were arranged to form complicated and mysterious symbols. Before I could understand what the inscriptions looked like, Mo, who was at the side, suddenly exclaimed, "Sword stone." "Sword stone?" I frowned. "What is a sword stone?" Mo said in a daze, I heard Master tell me that the sword stone is a stone formed by the remnant yang spirit after a sword cultivator's yang spirit failed and died. Master said that this stone is very precious. It's a priceless treasure for us sword cultivators. A stone formed after a failed yang spirit attempt? The yang spirit was formed by a cultivator's 3 souls. Even if it was formed by the remnant yang spirit, it must contain the cultivator's life's sword path. If it was used by future generations to comprehend, or even refine, it would definitely be able to greatly improve their cultivation. It wouldn't be too much to describe it as a priceless treasure. The Yang Spirit realm was an extremely profound cultivation, even for the blessed Grotto Heavens. Other than a few old ancestors of the great Grotto Heavens who had this cultivation, the other old ancestors of the blessed Grotto Heavens were only Yang Spirit celestial masters. No wonder the old Taoist Huang Zhu had risked his life to bring this item back. He probably wanted Mo to use this item to achieve his own sword path. At this moment, the Xianyuan sword in Xiang Lu's leather bag was shaking more and more violently. I could vaguely feel a sense of greed. It seemed that the Xianyuan sword was anxious to obtain this item. Although the Xianyuan sword was an ancient divine weapon, it was still a sword. This sword stone contained the sword path. It would definitely be a great supplement for the Xianyuan sword. If it was nourished, the Xianyuan sword's power would definitely increase. It was also a good thing for me. If this sword stone belonged to someone else, my first reaction would definitely be to get it for myself. But this item was left by the old Taoist Huang Zhu for Mo, so I couldn't have that thought. After thinking for a while, I ignored the Xianyuan sword and said to Mo, "This is the treasure that your master left for you. Go and keep it. It will be of great use to you in the future." Little Mo nodded obediently and walked over to pick up the sword stone. However, before he could reach his hand out, the sword stone flashed and a silver light shot towards little Mo. The speed of the silver light was extremely fast, and little Imo was so close to it that he couldn't dodge at all. Even I couldn't react in time. The silver light flashed past his index finger and cut his finger, causing a string of blood to flow out. Fortunately, this silver light was only aimed at his index finger. If it was aimed at his body, little Imo would definitely be severely injured. With a lingering fear in my heart, I quickly pulled him back. After checking his wound, I circulated my true essence and used it to warm the wound on his fingertip. After a while, the bleeding stopped, forming a faint scab. This sword stone could actually attack people. I didn't dare to let Imo take it and told him to stand to the side. I walked over and extended my hand to grab the stone. Just like before, another silver sword ray shot out and headed straight for my finger. Although the silver light was fast, my cultivation was far from what Imo could compare to. Adding on to the fact that I was fully focused, the moment the silver light shot out, Zhen Yuan surged out of my hand. With a casual wave, I destroyed the silver light and extended my hand to grab the sword stone. Just as my hand was about to touch the sword stone, the mysterious inscriptions formed by the countless small silver swords seemed to have come alive. They turned into countless small sword energies and shot towards me. Judging from their power, it was not inferior to the Heavenly Master's attack. I didn't dare to be negligent. I focused and released all of my Zhen Yuan and Shaman Qi in my body. They gathered in my hand and formed a huge palm. I grabbed in the air and caught all of the sword energies. There was a muffled pong sound. The sword energies had destroyed the huge palm that was formed by my Shaman Qi and Zhen Yuan. However, at the same time that the huge palm was destroyed, the silver light on the sword energies dimmed. It seemed that they didn't have enough power. They all returned to the sword stone and returned to the inscriptions. That should be all of the sword stone's protection. I smiled and grabbed it. Just as I thought, the sword stone didn't resist this time. However, I didn't expect that the Xianyuan sword box in Xiang Lu's leather pouch would suddenly shake violently the moment my hand touched the sword stone. I could feel an extremely strong desire through the leather pouch. Before I could react, the Xianyuan sword box broke out of Xiang Lu's leather pouch and flew into the air. It didn't stop at all and went straight for the sword stone. At this time, the Xianyuan sword box carried a strong sword will. It was so fast that I couldn't react at all. Even if I could react, I wouldn't dare to reach out to stop it. The sword will was so strong that even with my cultivation, if I tried to reach out now, my hand would probably be cut off. When it finally touched the sword stone, a burst of bright yellow light burst out from the Xianyuan sword box, directly wrapping the sword stone. The bright yellow light was very dazzling. I squinted and looked at it. The situation inside was completely covered. I couldn't see anything at all. Little Imo and I looked at each other and stood at the same spot. After 2 minutes, the bright yellow light finally dissipated. When the light completely disappeared, I looked up and was stunned. The sword stone that was the size of a human head had completely disappeared. The greedy intent just now was just my guess. I didn't expect that the Xianyuan sword box had really swallowed the sword stone. I turned to look at little Imo and felt awkward. This was Mo's thing, but it was swallowed by the Xianyuan sword box. It looked like I had snatched little Mo's thing. Taoist Huang Zhu had entrusted little Mo to me, so I could be considered his master now. He had just become my disciple, but I didn't even give him a greeting gift. Instead, I snatched his thing. What was going on? While I was feeling awkward, little Mo was silent for a while and seemed to understand. This kid was obedient. He looked at me with his big eyes and said softly, "This sword stone, just take it as Mo's gift for you to become my disciple." I smiled helplessly. The sword stone had already been swallowed. I couldn't make the Xianyuan sword box spit it out. This was the only thing I could do. Let's just treat it like this. But don't worry. Uncle will find another sword stone or a treasure more valuable than this sword stone to compensate you. Helpless, I could only give Imo an empty promise. Little Imo nodded and said obediently, "Thank you, Uncle." After making the promise, I temporarily let go of the awkwardness in my heart and looked at the Xianyuan sword box. Since the Xianyuan sword box was so eager for the sword stone, there would definitely be changes after it swallowed it. If this sword stone could make the Xianyuan sword release a little more power, then it wouldn't be a waste. I stared at the sword box for a long time. In the end, the sword box seemed to have taken a nap after eating. Compared to before, there didn't seem to be any changes. This shouldn't be the case. The sword stone was formed after the Yang spirit failed to advance. It was at least the sword path of a sword cultivator at the consummate Yang spirit realm. Even if it was nothing compared to the Xianyuan sword, it shouldn't have no reaction after it was swallowed. After waiting for a few minutes, there was still no movement from the Xianyuan sword. I was getting impatient. I took the sword box in my hand and tried to push the top partition of the sword box. Back then, the effect of the Jojo Cauldron was to push open the partition so that I could activate the Xianyuan sword to release sword light. At this time, if the sword stone was really useful, it would definitely open the partition. As it turned out, my speculation was right. This time, I didn't even inject Dao Qi. I just pressed on the partition and pushed it back lightly. The partition directly slid open. Moreover, it directly exceeded the previous largest position. Not only did it reveal a small gap, but it completely opened. Chapter 585. There really was a sword in the Xianyuan sword box. The first thing I saw was a sword hilt. At the bottom of the sword hilt, there was a square, transparent stone embedded there. There was a faint light flickering inside, as though there was a living creature swimming inside. The main body of the sword hilt, which was the sword stem, was a yellow cylinder. On the cylinder, there were countless protrusions, as though there were inscriptions carved on them. Outside the inscriptions, there was a 5-clawed divine dragon. On the divine dragon's body, there were 3 large characters, which were exactly the same as the 3 words on the sword box, Xianyuan sword. Further up, the divine dragon's head formed a guard and the sword's handle. The dragon opened its mouth, and a bright yellow long sword came out of the dragon's mouth. This was one of the 10 great ancient divine weapons, the Xianyuan sword. My heart was pounding. I knew that after it swallowed the sword stone, the Xianyuan sword box would definitely change, but I didn't expect it to open completely and reveal the Xianyuan sword. Previously, the sword box had only revealed a small gap. It could shoot out such a powerful sword light. Now that the Xianyuan sword was completely revealed, how powerful would it be? I was excited as I reached into the Xianyuan sword box and slowly grabbed the sword hilt. The first thing that touched the sword hilt was the tip of my middle finger. The moment I touched it, a brilliant aura rushed over, causing my entire body to shake. It was as though a tall figure with his feet on the ground and his head in the sky appeared in front of me. The figure seemed to be very far away from me, but it also seemed to be in front of me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel that he was looking at me. His gaze seemed to carry the power of the heavens, and I couldn't breathe. In an instant, my body, which hadn't sweated in a long time, was drenched in sweat. Under such pressure, my body couldn't move at all. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the figure seemed to turn his head and glanced at little Imo, and then suddenly disappeared. Just as I wanted to take a breath, a bright yellow light suddenly shot out from the Xianyuan sword. This light was similar to the sword light that shot out from the sword stone. It carried a sharp power that could pierce through heaven and earth, and it spread out in all directions. This time, the light was much faster than the sword light from the sword stone. It was so fast that I couldn't react at all. The moment I saw the light, I felt as though it had pierced through my body, and there was a sharp pain from many parts of my body. My heart instantly turned cold. My first thought was that I'd been hurt by the Xianyuan sword. I quickly lowered my head to check, but I was surprised to find that there were no wounds on my body. After the light shone on me, it just passed through my body, leaving a sharp pain. I was shocked. My first thought was that I had been hurt by the sword. I lowered my head to check, but I didn't get hurt. He was still a child. Even if the light didn't hurt him, the pain alone was unbearable. Unexpectedly, little Imo's current situation was completely different from mine. The light also found his body, but it didn't pass through him like I did. Instead, it stopped on his body. It wasn't just the light that shone on him. The light also found his body, but it didn't pass through him like I did. Instead, it stopped on him. It wasn't just the light that shone on him. The light from other directions seemed to be attracted too. It turned around and shone on him through the rain. This was the light emitted by the Xianyuan sword, and it was absorbed into his body. If it wasn't great misfortune, then it was great fortune. That was the light from the Xianyuan sword, and he was absorbing it into his body. If it wasn't bad luck, then it was good luck. Little Imo closed his eyes and stood there blankly. There was no expression on his face, and I couldn't see any joy or pain. I didn't care about the pain on my body and just stared at him without blinking. Little Imo finally opened his eyes. His eyes were filled with confusion, as though he didn't know what had happened. However, I heaved a sigh of relief, and joy surged in my heart. Little Imo couldn't see it himself, but I saw it. When he opened his eyes, a yellow sword light flashed in his pupils, and the aura of his cultivation jumped from the dragon-seeking realm to the acupuncture point realm. It might seem like the increase in realm was not that high, but in reality, the advancement from the dragon-seeking realm to the acupuncture point realm was related to the opening of the acupoints on the 8 extraordinary meridians. At this stage, all cultivators needed to use their own cultivation to attack the acupoints, opening them and entering the acupuncture point realm. However, little Imo wasn't like that. His acupoints were opened by the Xianyuan sword energy. Using my spiritual sense, I've already sensed that every acupoint in his meridians carries the aura of the Xianyuan sword. What's more terrifying is that the sword aura of the Xianyuan sword has opened 4 of his 8 extraordinary meridians. In the cultivation world, opening 4 meridians during the acupuncture point realm was considered a top-notch talent. So, little Imo was the same as me, with 4 top-notch meridians. In addition, he was born with a sword embryo physique, so his talent could be said to be extremely strong. With just a natural sword embryo, he would definitely be able to condense a sword true spirit within 60 years and become a young god. Now, with the Xianyuan sword's aura and 4 top-notch meridians, little Imo's future was simply unimaginable. Little Imo still didn't know what had happened. After I understood, I didn't tell him and only smiled at him. Sometimes, being too talented might not be a good thing, so I decided not to tell him about this for now. Otherwise, it would cause him harm if he became careless during his cultivation. After thinking about it, I temporarily put this matter aside and retracted my gaze. I calmed down slightly and reached out to grab the Xianyuan sword firmly in my hand. It wasn't as heavy as I had imagined. The Xianyuan sword was as heavy as an ordinary sword. It was neither light nor heavy in my hand, and it was very comfortable. However, when I lowered my head to look at it, whether it was the countless inscriptions on the hilt or the light on the sword, my eyes seemed to sink into it. Even my mind was in a trance. It seemed that with my current strength, I couldn't look at it for a long time. I hurried to move my eyes away and held the Xianyuan sword, swinging it a few times. I didn't feel anything strange. However, the Xianyuan sword wasn't meant to be swung. If I wanted to exert its power, I had to pour my Tao energy into it. Unfortunately, when I was fighting with Zhao Hao, I had used up all the Tao energy in my body. I hadn't recovered yet, so I couldn't pour it into the Xianyuan sword to test its power. At this moment, Officer Wang, Ah Fu, and the others appeared in the small temple. I guess they had finished dealing with Taoist Huang Zhu's body. Seeing them, I put the Xianyuan sword back into the sword case and Shang Liu's leather pouch. Officer Wang came quickly and gave me a gray clay jar. He didn't say anything, but I understood that the jar contained Taoist Huang Zhu's ashes. I called Imo and gave him the clay jar. Imo took the clay jar and didn't say anything. He just bit his lip and put the clay jar on the ground in the direction of the small temple. Then he knelt and respectfully kowtowed 3 times. After he finished kowtowing, I sighed and said to Officer Wang, "All right, it's late. Let's go back first." Officer Wang took my order and left with Ah Fu. Since it was already dark and raining, I picked up Imo and followed Officer Wang at full speed. Shortly after, we returned to the Wangwu Grotto Heaven. Taoist Huang Zhu had entrusted Mo to me. I should take him with me, but I was anxious to go back and study the Xian Yuan sword. Moreover, Mo would be safer with Officer Wang than with me. I thought for a while and asked Officer Wang to take Mo back first and arrange a place for him to stay. Then, I quickly returned to the small Taoist palace where I was temporarily staying. When I returned, the fatty was sitting cross-legged in the rain by the spirit lake outside the Taoist palace. He was cultivating with his eyes closed. He seemed to be at a critical juncture in his cultivation. When he saw me, he didn't talk to me. I was anxious to restore my Tao energy, so I walked over and sat next to him. I closed my eyes and adjusted my breathing for a while. Then, I began to absorb the overflowing true dragon chi from the spirit lake. The spirit lake was formed by the intersection of the 4 true dragon veins. The dragon chi in it was extremely dense. As I swallowed it, it didn't take long for the Tao energy in my body to be completely replenished. Chapter 586. Ever since I found out that the Xian Yuan sword could be used, I had used it many times to fight against enemies. Channeling Tao Qi into it was a walk in the park. It was just that when I channeled Tao Qi into the sword box would shoot out a sword light every time it reached a certain level. But this time it was different. I held the Xian Yuan sword in my hand and condensed my true essence into it. As soon as I poured a trace into it, an extremely strong suction force came from the Xian Yuan sword, and it instantly sucked away all the true essence in my body like a whale. This suction force was extremely domineering. It didn't leave any Tao Qi and true Qi behind. Fortunately, I still had witch Qi and true Qi in my body. Otherwise, if I could kill the enemy with one strike, it would be fine. But if I couldn't, I would be at the mercy of others. After absorbing the Tao Qi and true Qi, the Xian Yuan sword flashed. I didn't need to use any strength. It directly brought my hand and slashed forward. A bright yellow sword light suddenly slashed out and hid in the ground. This Taoist palace was where the 4 true dragon veins intersected. It was also the place where the ancestors of the Wang family cultivated. The ground was completely covered by the protective formation of Wangwu Grotto Heaven. When the sword slashed down, the ground only shook a little before returning to normal. But I was beside it, so I could naturally feel its power. I frowned slightly. How should I put it? The attack that I unleashed with the Xian Yuan sword with all my strength was indeed powerful. It also had a certain killing power against Yang Shun celestial masters. If other Seal celestial masters could unleash such an attack, they would naturally be ecstatic. But for me, if I used the armor-removing sword with all my strength, it seemed that I could also unleash a similar attack. And when I used the armor-removing sword, I could completely control the amount of Tao Qi I channeled. It wasn't like the Xian Yuan sword, where it was sucked dry. As such, the situation was a little awkward. Compared to the armor-removing sword, the Xian Yuan sword was a little weak. Of course, this was because I wasn't strong enough to unleash the true power of the Xian Yuan sword. If I was strong enough to fully activate the Xian Yuan sword, the armor-removing sword would be like a firefly compared to the Xian Yuan sword. After thinking for a while, I made a decision. For the time being, in this realm, I will mainly use the armor-dismantling sword. The Xian Yuan sword can only be used when my cultivation level improves in the future, at least when I become a Yang God Celestial Master. In this way, I could also avoid some trouble. After all, the Xian Yuan sword's reputation was too great. I had always understood the principle that treasuring a precious item would cause one to get into trouble. After making up my mind, I prepared to put the Xian Yuan sword back into the sword case. But at this moment, I suddenly remembered the small book that Taoist Huang Zhu had given me before he died. According to him, it was a sword cultivation technique that he had given me. At that time, he said that sword cultivation was particular about nurturing the sword with the person and nurturing the person with the sword. After cultivating, Under the nourishment of the Xianyuan sword, my cultivation would definitely improve rapidly, and the method of nurturing the sword would also allow me to unleash the power of the Xianyuan sword. Currently, the Xianyuan sword is temporarily useless to me, so it wouldn't be a bad thing if I could use it to practice this sword cultivation technique. After pondering for a while, I put the Xianyuan sword aside and took out the small notebook the old Taoist had given me. I opened it and started to read. This small notebook had 10 pages, and the content was divided into two parts. One was nurturing the sword, and the other was nurturing the sword. Each part had 5 pages. After skimming through it, I flipped to the nurturing the sword section and read it carefully. All the sword cultivators in the world use the person to nurture the sword. My lineage only cultivates the method of using the sword to nurture the person. When the person nurtures the sword and cultivates to the extreme, he or she will become the sword himself. However, the sword is an inanimate object, so how can we talk about the great path? If you want to pursue the great path, you must use the person as the person, and the sword as the support. Using the sword to nurture the person, then the great path can be achieved. After reading it carefully, I closed my eyes and silently comprehended. In this nurturing the sword section, not to mention the power, just this principle alone was extraordinary. The so-called cultivation was to cultivate the body, to break through the shackles, to transcend the heaven and earth, and to step into the great path. Not to mention sword cultivation, any technique in the world was only a support method, and the person was the core. Moreover, this nurturing the sword section also mentioned that in the method of using the sword to nurture the person, the stronger the sword, the stronger the nourishment. In terms of famous swords in the world, there was probably no better than the Xianyuan sword. That was why Taoist Huang Zhu's sword cultivation method was extremely suitable for me. Back when I was in the Earthmaster realm, I had the top talent of 4 meridians. Along with all sorts of fortuitous encounters, my cultivation speed wasn't too fast, but it was similar. Now that I was in the Heaven Master realm, the amount of Dao Qi and Shaman Qi required for every small step was several times that of before. Even now, with a total of 4 true dragon veins gathered together, I could only sit by the side and cultivate bitterly, but it only increased my cultivation speed by a little. In the Heaven Master realm, if I wanted to improve, I could only rely on the support of countless years of accumulation. Even if I had the talent of the forward seal, the increase in my cultivation speed was extremely limited. This nurturing the sword section was an opportunity. The Xianyuan sword was one of the 10 great ancient divine weapons. With the Xianyuan sword as a support to nourish my cultivation, even in the Heaven Master realm, it was enough to ensure that my cultivation speed far surpassed others. I calmed myself down and didn't cultivate for now. Instead, I continued to read the Nurturing the Sword section. According to the records, this Nurturing the Sword section was actually a supplementary technique of the Nurturing the Sword section. While using the sword to nurture the person was also nurturing the sword. Every day, one needed to use Dao Qi to cleanse the body of the sword and store its power. Therefore, the longer the sword was nurtured, the more powerful it would be. For example, Taoist Huang Zhu had nurtured the sword for 10 years and was able to kill a Heaven Master at the Glory of Knowledge realm. While washing the body of the sword every day, one was also training one's cultivation. This process was also known as nurturing the sword. According to the Nurturing the Sword section, with my current cultivation, every time I infused Dao Qi into the Xianyuan sword, I could explode with an attack that could threaten a Yang God Heaven Master. It wouldn't take long, just 10 days of nurturing the sword, and the accumulated power will be able to severely injure a Yang God Heaven Master. Nurturing the sword for 100 days, it was also possible to kill a Yang God Heaven Master with one strike. Moreover, during this process, my cultivation could also increase. If it was like what Taoist Huang Zhu had said, nurturing the sword for a year or even 10 years, its power would be unimaginable. From the looks of it, this Nurturing the Sword section was simply heaven-defying. Of course, The premise of all of this was that I had the Xian Yuan sword to achieve such an effect. If I didn't have the Xian Yuan sword, nurturing the sword for 100 days would only allow me to kill people of the same realm. Currently, I was only in the early stage of the Seal Heaven Master. If I wanted to kill a middle stage or late stage Seal Heaven Master, I would need to nurture the sword for a few years. If I wanted to kill a young God Heaven Master, I might not even be able to nurture the sword for 10 years. After all, the difference between a young God Heaven Master and a Seal Heaven Master was far greater than the difference between a Glory of Knowledge Realm and a Seal Heaven Master. I gathered my thoughts and took a few deep breaths to temporarily calm my excited heart. When cultivating, the most important thing to avoid is having too many emotional fluctuations. After many years of cultivation, I already had the power to control myself. After calming down, I flipped to the second page of the Nurturing the Sword section and found the detailed cultivation method. The first technique of the Nurturing the Sword section was called Sword Swallowing Scripture. This sword swallowing scripture, as the name suggested, was to swallow the sword. Once the sword was in the body, one could start nurturing the sword. This scripture made my heart jump. Although the street performers in ancient times had a sword-swallowing technique to entertain people, that was just a normal sword. What I wanted to swallow now was the Xian Yuan sword. With my current cultivation, I wouldn't be able to swallow a normal sword. Even if I had to bite and chew it to pieces, I wouldn't be able to do so. However, just looking at the Xian Yuan sword made me feel like I couldn't bear it. If I swallowed it, I suspected that its power would make me explode. Of course, this was just a concern. What I needed to think about was how to swallow the Xian Yuan sword. I held the Xian Yuan sword in my hand and pondered for a long time. In the end, I clenched my teeth. Cultivation was a difficult journey. No matter if I succeeded or not, I had to try first. I raised my head and opened my mouth. I held the Xian Yuan sword stem in my hand and raised it high, making the tip of the sword float above my mouth. Before I could put the tip of the sword into my mouth, the Xian Yuan sword flashed with sword energy and slashed at my tongue. Even if my cultivation was extraordinary and my physical body was extremely tough, the oral cavity was a weak spot. Under the sword energy from the Xian Yuan sword, countless wounds appeared in an instant. I didn't care about the pain from the wounds, but I was even more hesitant. Just the sword energy had cut open my oral cavity. If I really put it in my mouth, wouldn't my tongue be crushed? Chapter 587. In this world, opportunities and risks always coexist. I've used the Xian Yuan sword to cultivate this sword nurturing technique, and the benefits I've gained are great, even far beyond the imagination of the creator of this technique, but correspondingly, the risks are also great. That was the only way to be fair. I was prepared for it. After hesitating for a while, I didn't think about it anymore. I directly moved the tip of the sword down and put it in my mouth. As soon as I put it in my mouth, countless sword lights burst out. In the blink of an eye, countless small wounds appeared on my mouth and tongue. However, I was prepared. The true essence in my body circulated quickly. When the wounds appeared, they quickly healed. After repeating this process, I managed to reach a balance. After getting used to the tip of the sword, I followed the instructions in the sword nurturing scripture and began to move the true essence in my body, circulating it along a meridian in my mouth, throat, and esophagus. While the true essence was circulating, I left a part of it in each meridian. After circulating it 3 times, the Taoist, shaman, and true essence in my body had formed a thick barrier around this meridian. After that, I slowly moved the Xian Yuan sword down to the depth of my throat. At the same time, I silently recited the incantation recorded in the sword nurturing scripture. Speaking of which, the sword nurturing chapter was indeed miraculous. After I recited the incantation, a portion of Zhen Yuan suddenly surged out of my mouth. After the Zhen Yuan appeared, it formed a vortex in my throat, facing the tip of the Xian Yuan sword. As it spun faster and faster, a majestic suction force appeared. Under this suction force, the sword energy from the Xian Yuan sword no longer wreaked havoc in my mouth. Instead, it was all sucked into the vortex. After the sword energy disappeared, the Xian Yuan sword gradually approached the vortex. Because the power of the sword was too strong, the vortex trembled as soon as it approached. It almost collapsed. Seeing this, I hurried to mobilize the remaining Taoist and shaman qi in my body and gathered them in the vortex. After squeezing almost all the true essence in my body, the vortex finally stabilized. At this moment, the tip of the Xian Yuan sword finally touched the vortex. I suddenly had a strange feeling in my heart. It was similar to weightlessness, and my head was in a trance. When I woke up, I found that the tip of the Xian Yuan sword had sunk into the whirlpool. I thought that after the Xian Yuan sword entered the vortex, the throat and the esophagus would be the weakest parts. Even with the protection of the true qi, it would still be damaged. However, the strange thing was that after the Xian Yuan sword entered the vortex, I didn't feel anything strange. It seemed that the vortex was another space. After the Xian Yuan sword entered, it disappeared from my senses. Not being able to detect anything out of the ordinary meant that no harm had been done. I calmed down a little. Holding the Xian Yuan sword, I continued to swallow. The following process was unimaginably smooth. Inch by inch, the Xian Yuan sword was swallowed into his throat and disappeared into the vortex. In the end, only the hilt of the sword was left. The problem I was facing now was that the hilt was too big and my mouth was too small. A strange look flashed in my eyes. When I had decided to swallow the Xian Yuan sword, I hadn't thought that I would encounter such a problem. With my current cultivation, it's actually not difficult for me to change the size of a certain part of my body. However, the problem was that to swallow the Xian Yuan sword, I had used up all the true qi in my body. One part was used to protect my meridians, while the other was used to build the vortex. At this moment, I didn't have any true qi left in my body. Without the support of true qi, if I wanted to change the size of a part of my body, I could only rely on my physical strength. Thus, I tried my best to open my mouth and push the hilt of the Xian Yuan sword into my mouth. Because I was only using my physical strength, my face looked very twisted. Coincidentally, at that moment, a series of footsteps could be heard from outside the Doctrine Palace. Then, the door was pushed open and Fatty's figure walked in unsteadily. As soon as he entered the door, the fat man's light footsteps halted. He lifted his head and looked at me, his face full of disbelief. At this moment, I didn't have the time to care about him. I had already swallowed the handle of the Xian Yuan sword, leaving only the tip of the sword. The tip of the sword was a square, translucent stone that was much thicker than the sword handle. My face was twisted, and I used both my hands to lift my upper and lower jaw, almost breaking my teeth. I used all my strength to stuff the last part of the sword into my mouth. When I finally finished swallowing, the fat man recovered from his shock. He pointed at me and said, "Third baby, why, are you crazy? Did you go berserk in your cultivation? Why did you eat the sword?" Then he ran to me and patted my back. He said anxiously, "I'm a fat man. You should remember me, right? Listen to me. Hurry up and spit it out. Come, open your mouth and cough. If you can't, I'll choke you twice." As he said that, he reached out and stuffed it into my mouth. At this moment, the last part of the Xian Yuan sword hilt was still in my mouth and was slowly entering the whirlpool. I still didn't have any qi in my body. I wanted to block the fat man's hand, but he was so anxious that he reached in my mouth at lightning speed. His finger pressed in and coincidentally touched the hilt of the Xian Yuan sword. With a push, the last part of the sword entered the whirlpool and disappeared. As the Xian Yuan sword disappeared, the whirlpool quickly disintegrated. The qi that was used to protect the meridians also disappeared and returned to the meridians in the sky. After I recovered, I slapped the fat man's hand away and coughed a few times. I scolded him angrily. "I'm cultivating a spell. Choke. Choke your ass." The fat man was stunned. After being stunned for a long time, he asked me, There's such a spell? Eating swords?" It was hard to explain, and I was too lazy to explain in detail. I joked, "Yeah, eating swords. The more you eat, the stronger you get. When you eat 10,000 swords, you'll be invincible." The fat man was completely dumbfounded. His eyes stared blankly, and he didn't know what to say in shock. I patted his shoulder and said, "All right, didn't you just finish cultivating? You should rest first." "I haven't finished cultivating this spell. I'll go out and continue." In the sword nurturing chapter, after the sword swallowing spell, there was also the sword nurturing technique. After swallowing swords, one could cultivate it. Furthermore, it was specifically stated that the first time one cultivated it, one's power would increase greatly. Now that the heavenly grand ritual was approaching, I was anxious to increase my power. Thus, after speaking, I stood up and went to the lake outside. Even after I left, the fat man maintained a dumbfounded expression. He didn't seem to understand what I meant by the sword-devouring technique. After sitting cross-legged by the lake, I took a deep breath and absorbed all the spiritual energy in the lake into my mouth. Instantly, I felt energized and my tiredness from before had mostly disappeared. I wasn't in a hurry to start cultivating. Instead, I circulated the Tao Qi in my body. After one cycle, the Tao Qi in my body was replenished. Then, I picked up the sword nurturing chapter and started cultivating the sword nurturing technique. According to the records, I mobilized the Tao Qi in my body and had it flow out of the veins of the sky. It flowed along a strange vein. After one cycle, I could faintly sense the Xin Yuan sword's aura in my body. According to the sword nurturing chapter, I continued to circulate the Tao Qi in my body. After 3 cycles, I closed my eyes and looked inside. At the lowest part of the veins of the sky, the Xin Yuan sword floated in the air and emitted countless bright yellow lights. Below the Xin Yuan sword was my celestial master's seal. After looking inside and seeing the Xin Yuan sword, the next step was to inject the Tao Qi into the Xin Yuan sword. I carefully controlled the Tao Qi to flow to the bottom of the veins of the sky and wrapped it around the Xin Yuan sword. Not long after, the Xin Yuan sword produced a swallowing force that instantly swallowed all the Tao Qi. After swallowing the Tao Qi, the Xin Yuan sword shone even brighter. It trembled slightly, and a sword light appeared out of nowhere. However, it didn't explode. Instead, it revolved around the Xin Yuan sword. At the same time, the suction force of the Xin Yuan sword caused my body to produce a strong attraction to the spiritual energy around me. In an instant, there seemed to be a strong gust of wind on the surface of the lake. Countless spiritual energy gathered around me from all directions, causing the flowers and plants by the lake to be blown away by the violent spiritual energy. Thanks to the abundant spiritual energy in the lake, countless spiritual energy rushed into my body and quickly gathered around the Xin Yuan sword along the veins of the sky. However, this time, it didn't pour into the Xin Yuan sword. Instead, it circled around me and sank into the Celestial Master's seal below. When a Celestial Master cultivated, he absorbed spiritual energy from the outside world and channeled it into the Celestial Master's seal. He converted it into true essence and slowly increased his cultivation. However, because the suction force of a Xin Yuan sword was too strong, the spiritual energy that I channeled into my body was too abundant. After it surged into the Celestial Master's seal, the seal suddenly trembled. Then, a burst of power burst out, and the seal made a cracking sound. Hearing this sound, I wasn't shocked. Instead, I was happy. The seal breaking and regenerating was a unique phenomenon when one advanced. Chapter 588. After the Celestial Master's seal shattered, it turned into a puddle of black and white viscous liquid that spun rapidly at the bottom of the vein of the heavens, forming a whirlpool. The whirlpool was originally black and white, but as it spun, the two colors gradually separated and formed the shape of a yin-yang fish. At the same time, an even stronger suction force appeared from the depths of the whirlpool, tearing apart all the Taoist qi and shaman qi in the vein of the heavens in an instant. Not only that, but the suction force also followed the vein of the heavens and seeped into the outside world through my pores. In a split second, a tornado formed with me as the center of the world. It was originally raining in the summer, but after the tornado appeared, all the rain within a few hundred meters around me disappeared at the same time. One end of the thick tornado was on me, and the other end was in the air. As it spun and roared, the other end of the tornado gradually sank and landed on the lake formed by the 4 true dragon veins. As soon as the tip of the whirlwind touched the lake water, a whistling sound was heard. It was as if a dragon was sucking in water. The lake water, which contained a large amount of spiritual energy, surged up and was sucked into the whirlwind. In just a few seconds, the huge tornado was filled with ripples of spiritual qi, and the water level of the lake in front of me dropped by 3 feet. When the Xin Yuan sword used up all the Taoist qi in my body, I also swallowed the spiritual qi from the outside world. However, there was no change on the surface of the lake that time. From this, it could be seen how strong the suction force in the tornado was. After absorbing the lake water, the tip of the tornado finally left the lake and floated into the air again. I had originally thought that the spiritual energy required for my advancement was sufficient, and just as I was about to start absorbing it, the tornado swayed and turned to the side. The top of the tornado lowered once more and entered the Taoist palace at the side. The suction force exploded again. In the Taoist palace, the shaman qi that the Wang family had used a secret technique to convert started boiling. Just like the lake water that was filled with spiritual qi, it was sucked dry by the tornado. Although there was a large amount of shaman qi in the Taoist palace, it couldn't satisfy the appetite of the tornado. After it was sucked dry, the tornado didn't retreat, but continued to spin and roar. Within the Doctrine Palace, as the sorcerer qi had been completely devoured, the formation began to operate in a frenzy. A large amount of sorcerer qi was transformed and was immediately sucked away by the tornado. As the suction force of the tornado was too strong, apart from the sorcerer qi, the other things in the Taoist palace were also affected. The tables, chairs, beds, murals, and decorations were all swept out. Even Fatty, a living person, could not withstand the huge suction force of the tornado due to his lack of cultivation and was swept to the door. Fortunately, he had quick reflexes and grabbed onto the door with both hands, barely managing to stabilize his body. However, he was still swaying helplessly in the wind. Even his outer clothes had been ripped off by the strong wind, leaving only his underwear on his body. Seeing this, I was a little anxious. Although the tornado had been released from my body, I didn't have the power to control it. I could only pray that I could absorb enough shamanic energy as soon as possible. After an unknown period of time, the sorcerer qi in the tornado finally reached a balance with the Taoist qi. As if it had eaten its fill, it slowly floated away from the entrance of the Taoist palace. After it left, the small Doctrine Palace seemed to have suffered a disaster. Everything was scattered on the ground, and Fatty's body fell from the sky. He hugged his underwear and sat on the ground in a daze. It was obvious that he didn't understand what had happened. At that moment, I couldn't care less about him. After the tornado left the Taoist palace, it floated back into the sky. The sorcerer qi and Taoist qi that it contained suddenly began to flow into my body. Because the tornado was formed from the sorcerer qi and Taoist qi in my body, there wasn't a single trace of true yuan in my body. It was extremely dry, so the process of the Taoist qi and the sorcerer qi flowing into my body was not obstructed at all. However, the aura was too strong, far exceeding the limit that my body could contain. Thus, the feeling that I had when the dead Tai Sui had transferred the sorcerer qi to me in the corpse sect appeared again. This feeling was as if someone had cut a hole in my body and inflated it with an inflatable machine. At that moment, all of my limbs and bones swelled up, and the tornado began to shrink at a speed visible to the naked eye. At first, I could still endure it, but when the tornado had shrunk to half its original size, I began to feel a stabbing pain in my body. It was as if all of my pores had been pierced by steel needles. The pain wasn't intense, but it exploded at the same time, making me go crazy. At that moment, I couldn't even breathe. I could only grit my teeth and chant the calm heart incantation to endure. The death scripture didn't record the cultivation method after the celestial master realm, but I had discussed it with Jean Cameron before. From him, I learned that after the celestial master realm, the amount of heaven and earth spiritual energy required for every step forward was terrifying. When the celestial master seal was first formed, it was only 1 inch long, wide, and tall. As one cultivated and broke through to the early stage of the celestial master realm, the seal would shatter and regenerate, and its length, width, and height would become 3 inches. When one broke through to the late stage of the celestial master realm, it would become 6 inches. When one reached the consummate stage of the celestial master realm, the seal would eventually grow to 9 inches. The celestial master seal was a square object. The change in size didn't seem to be much, but in terms of volume, it wasn't as simple as just doubling. This was especially so for the early stage of the celestial master realm. From 1 inch to 3 inches, the actual change in volume was dozens of times. As for me, the amount of spiritual energy I absorbed from cultivating both Taoist and witchcraft chi was twice that of an ordinary celestial master. That was the main reason why my aura was so terrifying after my breakthrough. At that moment, the tornado had shrunk to half its original size. If I was an ordinary celestial master, I would have already finished absorbing the spiritual energy. That was the main reason why I felt like my body had reached its limit. Cultivating both Taoist and witchcraft chi gave me powerful combat power, but at the same time, the hardship of cultivation was incomparable to that of an ordinary cultivator. Fortunately, I had experienced countless difficulties on the path of cultivation. I had some experience with the feeling of my body on the verge of bursting. Hence, I didn't panic. I tried my best to calm my emotions and empty my body. I didn't reject the Taoist and witchcraft chi that surged into my body, but I actively absorbed it. At the same time, I began to compress the witchcraft chi that surged into my body. At the bottom of the celestial master seal, the prototype of the seal slowly took shape. As the celestial master seal was being reconstructed, the pressure in my body gradually decreased. When the seal's consumption and the external world's influx reached a balance, the bursting feeling finally disappeared. The tornado shrunk bit by bit, and the celestial master seal at the bottom of the heavenly meridian took shape. The process lasted for more than an hour. When the tornado completely disappeared, the celestial master seal in my body was already the size of an ordinary mid-stage celestial master seal. However, only half of the witchcraft chi had been consumed, and the other half was scattered all over my body. After another half an hour, the chi of witchcraft in my body was completely compressed into the seal. The seal's size increased again, and its size was twice that of an ordinary mid-stage celestial master. Looking at the seal's size, the life vitality in my body was twice that of an ordinary mid-stage celestial master. However, in reality, the Taoist and witchcraft chi were merged into one. For example, it was like soda water, and the witchcraft chi was like a bottle of chi. In my celestial master seal, it wasn't half water and half chi. Instead, the chi had merged with the water to form a bottle of soda water. When the soda water was shaken, the gas released from it could refill the bottle, and the original water would not be reduced. Hence, in reality, in my seal, be it the Taoist and witchcraft chi essential vitality, it was twice that of an ordinary person of the same realm. Adding the two together, in terms of true essence, I had 4 times that of an ordinary person of the same realm. In addition to some of the miraculous uses of the witchcraft chi, my current cultivation base had far surpassed that of an ordinary person of the same realm. This was also the strength of dual witchcraft cultivation. As one's cultivation base increased, the advantage would become greater and greater. After my cultivation base had completely stabilized, I let out a long breath. Light flashed in my eyes, and two sword shadows of the Xianyuan sword appeared in my eyes. They then turned into sword light and disappeared. I stood up and felt the power in my body. I couldn't help but feel happy. With the increase in my realm and the power of the armor-removing sword, I wouldn't even need to use the power of the Xianyuan sword in the All-Heaven tournament. Xiaohao was no match for me. After doing some simple exercises, I turned around and walked back into the small path palace. In the end, I saw the fatty when I raised my head. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.